Just after midnight on February 24, 1968, a submarine set out from a major Soviet naval base near the city of Petropavlovsk on Russia's far eastern Kamchatka Peninsula. The Cold War had been playing out for years in Vietnam in the form of a grinding proxy struggle, as well as in the frozen conflict in Korea. Now, officials both in the United States and the Soviet Union feared the situation was in danger of descending into a direct conflict between the superpowers. The Soviet-allied North Koreans had captured a U.S. spy ship. In the context of this crisis, a Soviet submarine K-129 received orders to head out early for a mission in the North Pacific, its third in quick succession. The K-129 carried 3 missiles capable of delivering a nuclear payload well over 700 miles and had been in service since 1960. Powered by a diesel engine, she belonged to the 629A class of submarines, known to the U.S. as Gulf II. Gulf subs weren't at the cutting edge of Soviet technology, but were still important assets in their arsenal. With an extra-large complement of 98 officers and sailors packed on board, this patrol was scheduled to continue through May 5, making a distant approach to American waters far northwest of Hawaii. But on March 8th, the Soviet base failed to receive a planned radio transmission from the sub. The following day, the Soviet Navy began sending out a flotilla of subs, other ships, and planes to search for the lost vessel. But with as much as 1 million square miles of ocean to search, they were unable to even locate a wreck. Months later, the Soviet government would inform the families of the crew aboard the K-129 that they were presumed dead. Because the Soviet command had made no attempt to disguise the major deployment of so many warships, the U.S. Navy immediately became aware of the operation, if not its purpose. But the Americans also had something called the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, a network of advanced audio receiving equipment in the Pacific, and they'd registered an explosion on March 11th. So they were able to surmise that their adversaries were searching for a lost and now sunken vessel. Not only that, they were able to locate the site of the explosion to within 6 miles. The Soviets were hundreds of miles off in their search party, and U.S. intelligence could examine the site without the risk of immediate interference. To take advantage of this opportunity, in what was called Operation Sand Dollar, the U.S. Navy sent a specially equipped spy submarine, the USS Halibut, for reconnaissance. Among the photos it captured were unmistakable images of a wrecked sub on the deep ocean floor. CIA officials realized that if the U.S. could access the Soviet submarine, the intelligence would be invaluable. But what they were suggesting was the single biggest technological challenge in their organization's history, and one of the most ambitious intelligence operations in history, period. The K-129 was resting at some 16,000 feet, nearly 3 miles beneath the ocean surface. At such a depth, the pressure is crushing. Ordinary submarines would never dive anywhere near that. Moreover, the heaviest object ever lifted from a comparable depth weighed 50 tons. They were proposing the recovery of an object that weighed 1,500 tons, and they would have to perform the incredible lift with complete secrecy. If Soviet intelligence discovered the mission, international law would shut it down, and in the Cold War, legal battle was hardly the biggest conflict that could develop between the two nations. The CIA might seem an unusual branch of government to carry out a naval mission. You might, for instance, think about using the Navy. There were people in naval intelligence who were not pleased to take a supporting role in what they considered to be their natural territory. But by now, the CIA had for several years demonstrated the ability to develop advanced technology on the fly, employing engineers as contractors in secret projects with minimal organizational friction. So began Project Azorian, named for the Azores Islands in the Atlantic Ocean for no particular reason. CIA codenames were essentially arbitrary. Still, this was really a new scale of research and development. The technology to lift a heavy object from the bottom of the ocean did not exist. Even mining and drilling in deep water were considered a considerable challenge. But that fact actually helped to provide the mission with its cover. The story would actually be another major project of naval engineering, building a ship-based deep ocean mining rig. There would be some overlap in the equipment needed, and the building of a huge recovery ship impossible to hide would make perfect sense. If all went well, Soviet spies wouldn't even think to look for a military or intelligence component to the civilian industrial product. In 1970, the company Global Marine was the leader in development and operation of deep-sea mining equipment. They had that year successfully tested complex manipulation of seafloor drilling equipment with their ship the Glomar Challenger. Funding the research would present two challenges. First, the expensive project of course had to be given the green light from the highest levels, but there also had to be some explanation for the funding of the extensive development. To that end, the eccentric and private billionaire Howard Hughes lent his name as the mining operations investor of record, forming a shell corporation called Summa to hide the money for Project Azorian. Hughes had assisted with intelligence gathering in the past, and in addition to being a plausible funder, his inaccessibility meant he wasn't likely to be a security risk. He may not even have known or cared exactly what the real operation was, but his name added a kind of luster to the cover story, which received some interest from the press. The Hughes Global Marine Venture would be the development of equipment that could gather nodules of manganese and other minerals that accumulated around sediment on the ocean floor. In principle, it seemed like it could be a profitable enterprise, and since no one had ever tried it before, there was no hard evidence to the contrary. Early on, the CIA team rejected exotic ideas like extracting hydrogen from the water around the wreck to create a balloon that would lift the sub. Instead, they would use what was called a string, actually a series of steel pipes, to lower a remote-operated capture vehicle with a claw to the ocean floor. The vehicle would have a detachable complement of legs as a kind of lander, which would allow leverage to initiate the tremendous lift, without the risk of sinking into the seafloor if it proved semi-fluid. The legs would then detach and the string would be pulled up one segment at a time. The ship itself, the Glomar Explorer, would have a giant hidden moon pool in its hull that could accommodate the submarine, which measured over 320 feet in length. Pulling the wreck to the surface required that the vehicle remain virtually stationary in the water, and so the Explorer was outfitted with a complex gimbal system that allowed continual adjustment in the effective center of mass for the huge ship. But there was also the matter of the nuclear weapons. The recovery crew would have to treat the entire wreck as contaminated because the material within the warheads would have by then leaked onto everything. Plus, there were nuclear-tipped torpedoes, but the payoff would be an inside look at the Soviet nuclear weapons program. In addition to all of the technology of the submarine itself, even more valuable would be insights into the Soviet Union's communication systems, specifically their coded communications. Provisions were made to try to salvage waterlogged paper to preserve the K-129's codebooks and other records. By 1974, the undertaking had overcome all the engineering obstacles, at least they hoped, not to mention calls from some who were in the loop to call off the project that was costing hundreds of millions of dollars, with a dubious chance of success. The ship was its own prototype. The team could do testing closer to shore, and did, off California's Santa Catalina Island. But the whole thing was designed for one mission, and likely they'd only get one try. Once the Explorer was in place about 1,500 miles west of Hawaii, with sophisticated, essentially experimental equipment, it took longer than planned to get everything running properly for a retrieval attempt. There was an inkling of what the Americans were up to, but the CIA mission had apparently managed to keep intel out of the hands of any foreign agents, and the task itself seemed impossible, so it was reasonable for the Kremlin to brush aside fears that the US might recover the K-129. Still, while the recovery team were in position, the Soviets took notice and sent a surveillance mission in what looked like a civilian vessel to contact the Explorer. They exchanged messages in Russian, and the command on the Soviet ship bought the cover story. This was, they determined, what it looked like, an experimental mining expedition. Still, not everyone in the Soviet military brass was convinced, and later a tugboat arrived with much the same purpose. The interaction the second time was, in a way, both more confrontational and less harried for the recovery team. With the tugboat in close visual range of the Explorer, the Soviet sailors mooned the American rig workers, who responded in kind, after which the enemy tugboat departed. This was not the peak of tension in the Cold War. When all of the components of the ship were ready, the crew of the Explorer began lowering the recovery vehicle Clementine nearly 3 miles to their target, one steel pipe section at a time. The lander arrived above the hull of the sunken submarine, and the arms of the recovery craft closed and took hold. Up at the other end of the video feed, remote steering of the robotic vessel took great skill and cool nerves. Once the arms were in place, the remote pilot began the incredible feat of lifting the enormous payload from the seafloor with the force of the lander's legs. Fortunately, the ocean bottom was quite solid, preserving more lifting power than a fluid base would allow. Once the sub was safely suspended in the water, the legs were detached and the rest of the power to pull would come from the string. As sections of the pipe were removed from the string, the cumulative weight dropped significantly, reducing the force needed to pull each time. But partway up, 2 of Clementine's claws broke, and the submarine they held snapped. Most of the K-129 broke away and fell back to the seafloor. Although a chunk was still in her grasp, the recovery team had to relay this news back to Langley. The first reaction from the Home Office was to abort and try again, but the engineers of the Glomar Explorer knew that if they stopped and reset, they were likely to come back completely empty-handed. Even a partial success had been far from assured. In the end, their boss at the CIA relented and let the team continue with the lift. At last, a portion of the submarine rose up and into the moon pool. Everyone intended to make necessary repairs and adjustments to the equipment and return to the site the next time ocean conditions were favorable, the following summer. The missiles and most of the sub remained unrecovered, but a second expedition would never happen. The Soviet Union may never have learned the extent of Project Azorian, but journalists in the US were picking up clues to the story. Eventually, the Los Angeles Times received a tip with enough details to report on the real mission behind Project Jennifer, and a popular radio commentator broadcast an opinion piece on the story. Whatever the American public may have thought about the funding of CIA Black Ops was irrelevant though, since a return trip would have required the same secrecy as the first. Workers now suited up to handle the wreckage laced with nuclear waste. There would be no missiles in this section, but the presumption was that the radioactive material would be everywhere. Additionally, there were nuclear-tipped torpedoes in the recovered portion. As the crew bagged equipment that might have value for American intelligence, they also found the remains of 6 sailors from the K-129's last unfortunate voyage. Orders were to treat all human remains, including fragments, with respect and dignity. Before the Glomar Explorer returned to port, the sailors received a burial at sea with military honors, with both the Soviet naval flag and the American flag on display, and both of the nation's anthems played. The ceremony was videotaped, and years later, when the Cold War adversaries had awakened from their decades-long nightmare, a later CIA director would present the naval flag and the video to Boris Yeltsin, first president of the newly established Russian Federation. The final price tag for Project Azorian was $350 million. It took longer to plan than the early space missions and coincided with the Nixon era, when American confidence in the government in general was low, and the illegal abuse of secrecy was rampant. Like the space program, it did offer some spin-off technology. Almost as an afterthought, it made major advances in the field of deep ocean drilling, and the Glomar Explorer would later serve a function similar to its cover story. The requirements of détente with the Soviet Union necessitated a calculated silence about the program, since an acknowledgement by the Americans would embarrass their adversaries, unhelpful in strategic negotiations. In fact, it was in response to Freedom of Information Act requests about the project that the CIA developed its so-called Glomar response, that it would neither confirm nor deny a matter in question. But parts of the project were declassified in 2010, following the release of Michael White's 2009 documentary Azorian, The Raising of the K-129. Josh Dean's The Taking of K-129, published in 2017, provides most of the details of our coverage, but the exact extent of the intelligence that was gleaned from the K-129 remains a secret. May 7, 1915. The great cruise liner the Lusitania is within sight of the Scottish coast. Suddenly, a periscope breaks through the waves, and a German U-boat is about to rewrite the history books. The Lusitania was launched in 1906 as a luxury cruise liner, much like similar ships such as the infamous Titanic. This was the age of the luxury liner, with fierce competition, especially between Britain and France, to design and launch the grandest and fastest ships in the world. Owned by Cunard Shipping Line, the Lusitania was partly funded by the British military, on the condition that if war were to break out, the mighty ship would serve as a cargo vessel. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Lusitania was not pressed into service as expected and instead remained as a passenger liner. Instead, the ship was secretly retrofitted for potential wartime service, with expanded cargo holds and even well-camouflaged gun turrets hidden under coils of rope on the deck. This was before the British Admiralty had come to appreciate the threat posed by German U-boats. The British Navy dwarfed the German Navy, and the idea that it would be the Germans who starved Britain into submission instead the other way around was a laughable one as the war began. However, Germany understood its tactical position far better than even the British, and knowing it could not compete with the Royal Navy on the surface, it took to new technology to subvert it from below, the infamous U-boat. Early U-boats were less true submarines and more temporarily submerged craft. Their electric batteries would allow them to cruise under the water and out of sight of surface ships, but they regularly needed to surface in order to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. If they wanted to move at any significant speed, they had to do so on the surface as well, where they were incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire. However, U-boats could remain submerged long enough to break the British blockade in the North Sea and move it into the Atlantic, where they could wreak havoc on British shipping. International law mandated that U-boats follow prize laws. These rules of war were aimed at limiting the devastation of war. Under these laws, U-boats must allow a merchant ship to evacuate their vessel and get to safety unless they were close to land, in which they could remain in their lifeboats. More importantly, the law stated that passenger ships may not be sunk. As the war progressed, the Germans obeyed these laws. But then the British changed the rules. An empire that depended wholly on the sea, Britain was particularly vulnerable to Germany's blistering successful U-boat campaign against it. Soon, the British began to arm merchant vessels with hidden guns. Under international law, U-boats were forced to surface and warn merchants their vessels were to be sunk, which gave British Q ships, as they came to be called, time to unveil their hidden guns and sink the U-boat. This blatant exploitation of international law led to Germany declaring a war zone around the British Isles on February 4, 1915. This now meant that any ship entering those waters and flying the British flag was under threat of German attack. This move deeply angered neutral countries, especially the US, and in a bid to avoid any unfortunate catastrophes, the German embassy in the United States put out ads in newspapers warning that Britain had been declared a war zone and that ships sailing to England should be avoided. The declaration of a war zone around British waters was an unexpected boon to the British. For a long time, the British Admiralty, led by young Winston Churchill, had been pushing for a strategy to lure in neutral ships in the hopes that they'd be attacked by the Germans. As Churchill himself said, if a neutral ship should be attacked and end in tragedy, all the better. Arming merchant vessels wasn't the only way a desperate Britain was flouting international laws, however, as it was also using civilian ships to transfer desperately needed supplies from the US. Passenger liners were off-limits targets to German U-boats, a fact that the British took advantage of by smuggling war supplies in their holds. Germany repeatedly warned Britain and the US about this practice, but it was ignored. Germany thus had no choice, and with the declaration of a war zone around Britain, unrestricted submarine warfare would begin. Ignoring all warnings that any ship flying the British flag would be attacked, passengers boarded the Lusitania in the New York harbor on May 1, 1915. As they boarded, several of the ship's wealthiest passengers received an emergency telegram warning them that the Lusitania was under U-boat threat. The passengers ignored this telegram, laughing it off as a joke. They'd been reassured that the Lusitania was too fast for any U-boat, and were still under the impression that even if they were attacked, the Germans would allow them to board lifeboats before sinking the ship. They couldn't have been more wrong, and the ominous telegram, whose origin remains a mystery to this day, was no joke. The British Admiralty had broken the German radio codes and been listening in on its communications with its U-boats for a while now. While U-boats were still incredibly difficult to locate, they had listened as the commander of a U-boat U-20 departed his anchorage in North Germany and then communicated that he had arrived on station off the Scottish coast. The British knew that a U-boat was in Lusitania's path and were keenly aware of the 128 Americans on board the ship, yet they said nothing, in the hopes that if the Americans met with tragedy, it would spur them to join the war. 6 days after leaving New York with the coast in sight, a U-boat U-20 fired a single torpedo at the Lusitania. The explosion tore a massive hole in the side of the large ship, and she began to take on water. Moments later, a second explosion rocked the cruise liner, sealing her fate. Other ships had taken much greater damage than her and sunk in hours. Yet the Lusitania was under the waves in less than 20 minutes, dooming most of her passengers. The second explosion, long believed to be the result of secret munitions being carried in her hold, was actually due to a boiler exploding on contact with ice-cold water, adding to the damage and increasing the rate of flooding. However, what truly doomed the ship was the lack of electricity, which prevented watertight doors across compartments from being closed and sealing off the flooded sections. In short order, nearly 1,200 people were dead, including 128 Americans and over 100 children. When news of her sinking spread around the world, the British Admiralty went into a panic, trying to conceal the real circumstances behind the sinking. All evidence at the time wrongly pointed to the secondary explosion being caused by the secret munitions being set off, and the truth wouldn't be discovered until nearly 80 years later. At the time, however, the Admiralty had to suppress all evidence of the secret munitions or risk losing goodwill from the world community. They had to desperately spin the event as a bloodthirsty attack on an innocent passenger liner, especially in America, as the fate of the war depended on this one big lie. The Admiralty, however, also had to ensure that the Americans never discovered that they'd been aware of the pending attack the entire time. If Washington ever found out that the Admiralty had intercepted U-20's messages, they might not only refuse to join the war but might even cut off all aid completely. Luckily for the British, the American public was swept up in anti-German furor over the sinking of the Lusitania, and the fact that the British had been aware of the pending attack wouldn't come to light until decades later. Americans were angry, with many clamoring for war against Germany, but President Woodrow Wilson remained reluctant to embroil the US in a European war. Then in August, a German U-boat sunk yet another British ocean liner, the SS Arabic, which also had Americans on board. The Germans claimed the attack had been in self-defense, as the Arabic was attempting to ram them. Truthfully, British ships had been instructed to do just that if they encountered a U-boat, as their massive bulk would easily cut a U-boat in half. President Wilson warned Germany that if their investigation of the incident proved Germany was at fault, it could lead to a war. Germany conceded and announced that it would once more instruct its U-boats to warn merchant ships and get their crews to safety before sinking the ship. As the British were still actively arming their merchant ships, also against international law, this placed German U-boats at huge risk. But for the Germans, it was favorable to the US entering the war on the side of the British. The US would remain neutral for 2 more years, until British intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German foreign minister to the German minister to Mexico. The telegram stated that Germany would once more resume unrestricted submarine warfare in a bid to cut off supplies to England, and that it would begin to sink any ship flying the British flag. It specifically warned that this would include even ships carrying American passengers, and attempted to draw up a contingency should the US enter the war. In exchange for Mexico's aid against the US, the Germans would offer large amounts of financial aid and help it restore its lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The intercepted telegram was rushed to President Wilson, who was immediately outraged. In an unprecedented move, the president authorized for the telegram to be published in its entirety in American newspapers, stoking anti-German sentiment to a fever pitch. Just days later, the American Congress approved the US's entry into the war on the side of the Allies, just as Britain had always wanted and been willing to trade innocent American lives for. Sirens blare as valves purge air and 2 submarines descend into the depths of the ocean. Sailors sprint through the narrow corridors of the submersible, turning valves and reloading torpedoes into spent tubes. As the submarines dive deeper, the HMS Venturer releases a final barrage of torpedoes. They all miss, except one. Over the hydrophone, the sound of an explosion and the twisting of steel can be heard. The first and only underwater submarine battle is over. A mangled German U-boat sinks to the depths of the ocean. In 1944, the Germans launched Operation Caesar. It was a last-ditch effort to buy the Axis powers more time to turn the war around. They were in deep trouble as Allied forces closed in on all fronts. Germany hoped they could sneak advanced technology to Japan using a submarine classified as U-864. This would allow Japan to continue the fight in the Pacific, hopefully drawing Allied forces away from the collapsing Axis armies. The Nazis loaded advanced weapon designs such as schematics and parts for the Jumo 004 turbojet and guidance components for the V-2 ballistic missiles onto the U-864. The U-boat was just under 300 feet long and designed to carry large cargo shipments long distances. U-864 was also loaded with massive amounts of liquid mercury, which was used for manufacturing explosive primers. The crew was briefed on their mission. German and Japanese scientists were loaded onto the U-boat, and on December 5, 1944, Captain Raoul Reimar Wolfram launched U-864 and proceeded toward the Arctic. His path was laid out to sneak past the Soviet Union undetected and deliver the cargo to Japan. But from the beginning, the mission seemed to be doomed. U-864 proceeded north. Allied forces patrolled most of the waters in the area, so Wolfram knew he needed to travel as stealthy as possible. To do this, he would need to take risks and move into more dangerous waters. In order to have Axis protection for as long as possible, U-864 sailed along the coast of northern Europe, where air support remained in range. As the U-boat made its way through the shallow waters, disaster struck. Wolfram grounded the sub while trying to pass through the Kiel Canal. The jagged rocks tore the hull of the submarine. The crew had to assess the damage, and once inventory was taken, Wolfram had no choice but to turn the sub around and return to dry dock for repairs. The treacherous journey around the Arctic would require everything to be working perfectly, and until the U-boat was repaired, it had no shot of making it all the way to Japan. U-864 stealthily made its way to Bergen, Norway, which was still controlled by Axis powers. As the sub was being repaired, Allied forces launched a bombing run into Norway. They weren't aiming for U-864, but the dry dock where the U-boat was being repaired was a target. The British planes roared over the Axis base. Anti-aircraft guns fired their cannons into the sky, trying to take out the bombers before they could drop their payloads. Most of the bombers made it to their target and dropped a series of Tall Boy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs around the dry dock. The bombs were specifically designed to penetrate the surface and detonate below ground to send the explosions full force through the bedrock. The result was the destruction of underground structures like submarine pens and bunkers. Unfortunately for U-864, it was in the submarine pen when the detonations occurred, causing even more damage to the U-boat. This led to further delays in Operation Caesar and the mission to deliver the cargo to Japan. The numerous delays for repairs would culminate in the only underwater submarine battle in history. Unknown to the Germans, the British had cracked their codes. The Allies intercepted a communication about U-864's mission and knew they couldn't let the Nazi sub make it to Japan. They immediately dispatched the HMS Venturer to destroy the U-boat. The Venturer was almost twice as fast as the bulky U-864, but it was also much smaller. It had a limited crew and could fire 4 torpedoes at once, but only held a relatively small number of torpedoes on board compared to U-864's arsenal of 22 torpedoes. This meant that the Venturer needed to make every shot count. The Venturer left for its mission under the command of Lieutenant James S. Launders on February 6, 1945. The plan was to intercept U-864 off the coast of Norway. Launders had sunk 13 vessels during the war, including a German submarine that had surfaced. The problem that Launders faced now was finding the exact location of U-864. He knew the general vicinity, but the vastness of the ocean and the technological challenges of locating a submerged submarine without giving his position away made his mission incredibly difficult. The main method the Venturer had to locate U-864 was the use of hydrophones. This device could listen for sounds of enemy submarines underwater. However, it was only effective at a limited range, and there was a lot of ocean to cover. The other way the Venturer could locate an enemy submarine was through active sonar, by sending out an acoustic wave and waiting for it to bounce off an enemy sub. The location of the vessel could be obtained. However, the problem with active sonar was that it also alerted the enemy to the location of the Venturer. The Venturer reached the coordinates where U-864 was supposed to be located. They scoured the area for any signs of the German U-boat but came up empty. Unfortunately for the Venturer, U-864 had already passed through their location and was now out of range of the hydrophones aboard the British submarine. Launders had missed his chance. The Nazi U-boat was on its way to Japan. However, U-864's bad luck was not over yet. The U-boat's diesel engine began to misfire, causing the vessel to slow down. Wolfram was forced to make another difficult decision. Either he pressed forward, which was a huge risk, or returned to dry dock for additional repairs. Again, Wolfram knew the journey through the Arctic would be brutal, and if anything happened to the engine while in the icy cold region, he and his entire crew would perish. So Wolfram decided to turn around and head back to Norway. Wolfram had no way of knowing he was headed right into the Venturer's trap. It was only out of sheer bad luck that the failing diesel engine aboard the U-864 caused the U-boat to turn around and head straight toward Launders and his vessel. The crew of the Venturer were monitoring the area, even though they had almost completely given up hope of ever locating the German U-boat. Then, one of the crew picked up something on the hydrophones. It was the misfiring diesel engine of the U-864. The alarm was sounded and the crew prepared for the chase. The Venturer stealthily moved toward the sound of the misfiring engine of the U-864. Then Launders saw what he suspected was the periscope or snorkel mast sticking out of the water. The snorkel mast allowed submarines to travel just under the surface of the ocean and still pump the oxygen the diesel engine needed into the vessel. The Venturer had located its target. The diesel engines were turned off so the sub could run silently underwater on battery power. Launders waited for the U-boat to surface so he could take a shot. Unfortunately, U-864 could stay just below the surface of the water using its snorkel for the duration of its journey back to port. Then the U-boat did something strange. It began zigzagging from side to side. Launders knew the Germans must have either suspected they were being pursued or had already detected his submarine. The chase continued for hours. U-864 refused to surface and began taking even more drastic evasive actions. This alerted Launders that the Germans were now fully aware that they were being followed. The Venturer's batteries were running low, and the submarine would soon need to surface itself, which would leave it vulnerable to attack by the German U-boat. Launders gave the command to arm all torpedoes. The captain calculated the trajectory and depth of the U-boat with the limited data he had. The order to fire blared across the speakers of the torpedo bays. The Venturer ripple-fired 4 torpedoes, with each being launched just about 18 seconds apart. The second 2 torpedoes were fired at a lower depth just in case the enemy dove deeper. Launders ordered the Venturer to immediately dive in case of a counterattack. As the sub descended into the blackness of the ocean, the crew waited with anticipation. Time seemed to freeze as everyone on the Venturer held their breath, waiting for the hydrophone operator to confirm a hit. There was no explosion. It seemed as if all the torpedoes had missed. Hope began to leave the crew of the Venturer. Then suddenly the hydrophone operator perked up. The sound of an impact explosion. and the tearing apart of iron could be heard over the headset. U-864's hull ripped open, and the entire vessel collapsed in on itself from the massive pressure of the ocean. The last torpedo fired had found its target. The hydrophone operator waited patiently until he heard the enemy U-boat thud against the bottom of the seafloor. All 74 people on board U-864 were lost to the ocean. The Axis powers' hopes of delivering weapons and materials to Japan sank with the German submarine. The site of the wreck remained undisturbed for over 50 years until the Norwegian Navy located it. U-864 was lying in a crumpled heap on the bottom of the ocean, but its cargo of mercury was leaking out of the vessel and into the water. Also, the U-boat had unexploded ordnance within its hull. In order to stop the leak and prevent any accidental explosions, the Norwegian authorities decided to cover the wreck under 160,000 tons of sand and rock. The battle between U-864 and the Venturer was the only underwater submarine battle in history. But why? Submarines had been used as far back as 1776 during the American Revolutionary War, with the submersible known as Turtle. How is it possible that there was only one underwater submarine battle? There are a few reasons. World War II was the height of submarine warfare. After the war ended, submarines were still used, but normally only for moving cargo and as support. During World War II, submarines needed to spend most of their time on the surface, so their diesel engines could get the air they needed. This meant that submarine warfare often took place on the surface and not underwater. Also, before and during World War II, when submarines were underwater, there was no accurate way to gauge exactly where the enemy was in three-dimensional space. Lastly, torpedoes at the time were designed to float up to the surface to strike ships, so firing a torpedo at an underwater target was not ideal. This is not to say that other submarine engagements didn't occur, just that underwater battles were incredibly rare because of these limitations. Today, submarines are equipped with radar and guided torpedoes that would make underwater battles possible, but no wars are currently being fought under the waves of the ocean. This all shows that what the Venturer did by destroying U-864 underwater was incredibly impressive. It also happened due to a considerable amount of luck. The torpedoes fired by the Venturer were more or less shot blindly into the ocean abyss, and the fact that one of them impacted U-864 was nothing short of a miracle. Two boats tear through the water in hot pursuit of a narco submarine. "Alta su barco! Alta su barco! Ahora!" screams one of the Coast Guardsmen just before three camouflage-clad members of the elite United States Coast Guard boarding team leap aboard the submersible, carefully balancing on the wet surface of the sub as waves rush over his feet. A Coast Guardsman pounds on the hatch. One of the drug smugglers opens it, putting his hands up in surrender. You may have seen the gripping footage taken by one of the Coast Guardsmen's helmet cams. On June 18, 2019, in the East Pacific waters off the Colombian and Ecuadorian coasts, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Monroe captured a 40-foot narco submarine. However, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment bust or a stroke of good luck for the Coast Guard. This narcotics bust was set into motion about 12 hours earlier. The USCG Monroe, which is deployed out of Alameda, California, is a newer ship, having just been commissioned in 2017. It's just one of the Coast Guard's 8 Legend-class national security cutters. These ships featured advanced command and control capabilities, aviation support facilities, and increased endurance, making them perfectly suited for long-range patrols. The Monroe is 418 feet and can carry up to 148 crew depending on the mission and configuration. Early on in the morning of June 18th, the Monroe's commanding officer, Captain James Estramonte, received intelligence on a suspected narco submarine from a Navy P-3 surveillance aircraft, which was patrolling the Pacific Ocean roughly 200 miles west of the Colombian-Ecuador border. Submarines filled with drugs sound like the stuff of movies, but they've recently become a favorite way for cartels to transport illegal drugs secretly beneath the waves. Now, these aren't military-grade subs, with most only able to descend a few meters below the water at most, but that can often be more than enough to smuggle thousands of pounds of drugs like cocaine without detection. The suspected narco sub had been spotted heading north, some 250 miles away from the Monroe's current position. Based on that initial intelligence, the Coast Guard estimated that the smugglers had around 1,000 miles left to go before they would reach the United States. Captain Estramonte ordered the cutter's speed increased to 25 knots or 28 miles per hour in order to catch up with the illegal vessel. While en route, Captain Estramonte and the crew of the Monroe would devise their plan for how to take on the illegal narco sub, if that was in fact what they were approaching. Some 10 hours later, and about 20 miles from the sub, the crew of the Monroe was close enough to set their plan into motion. Armed with pistols and wearing night vision goggles, 13 members of the elite Coast Guard boarding team launched in 2 small boats, a 26-foot aluminum patrol boat called a Mark IV and a rigid-hull inflatable 35-foot long-range interceptor. Both of these vessels are built for speed, topping out at about 45 knots or 52 miles per hour. Meanwhile, as boarding crews were slicing through the water toward the sub, the Monroe's Helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron, aka HITRON, launched a helicopter to provide a sniper overwatch with a 50 caliber rifle, as well as provide visual play-by-play updates of the operation to the captain. The Coast Guard boats quickly pulled up on either side of the sub. A Coast Guardsman yelled for them to stop in Spanish, but the sub continued, the occupants likely unable to hear the command. Then, boarding team members jumped on the back of the sub and banged on the hatch, finally alerting the crew to their presence. Fortunately, the smugglers quickly surrendered without a fight, though the boarding team was prepared for an altercation. 5 suspected drug smugglers were arrested and handed over to the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Coast Guard spent the next 12 hours unloading the huge haul of cocaine from the sub. They seized more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine, worth an estimated $232 million, making it the Coast Guard's largest single seizure since 2015. Then, after a final sweep for contraband with photos taken for evidence, the sub was intentionally scuttled. This dramatic bust is only one episode in the long-running cat-and-mouse saga between the Coast Guard and drug traffickers. Throughout the 1980s, speedboats were the main drug-running weapon of choice for narcotics traffickers. The authorities fought back by deploying fast ships of their own. The cartels began to focus on smuggling cocaine concealed in products via cargo ship. In the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the United States, Mexico, and Colombia intensified their war on drugs, resulting in several massive drug busts at various spots. The cartels had to come up with new and creative ways to ensure their illicit products reached their destinations. For a long time, there were rumors of drug traffickers building DIY narco submarines in the jungles of South America and using them to transport drugs before the Coast Guard finally captured one in 1993. The vessel was wood and fiberglass, but could not fully submerge and only traveled at 10 miles per hour. Since then, narco submarines have grown increasingly more sophisticated. Some of the more recently captured vessels are equipped with GPS and are able to mask their heat signature, use lead siding to help mask their infrared signature, and are designed to be extremely difficult for radar, sonar, and infrared systems to detect. Many of the subs can travel at 18 to 22 knots or 20 to 25 miles per hour. Advanced narco subs can cost upwards of $1 million to build, but a single successful drug-running trip often allows traffickers to recoup their spending. The average narco sub is 40 to 50 feet long and can carry thousands of pounds of narcotics. U.S. authorities have captured vessels carrying as much as 7.5 tons of cocaine, with an estimated street value of $180 million. Narco subs also carry other illicit cargo such as weapons and cash. The Coast Guard actually classifies narco submarines into 4 types: low-profile vessels or LPVs, the top of which sit just above the waterline. These vessels aren't entirely submerged, but they're difficult to spot. Usually their tops are painted blue or in a way that makes visual spotting hard. The sub captured in the June 18th bust would be considered an LPV. Semi-submersible narco submarines are very similar to LPVs, the difference being that they can completely lower themselves below the waterline except for a snorkel-like tube or air duct to provide air to the crew. The third type of narco subs are fully submersible vessels. This style of drug smuggling submarines are rare due to the high cost and technical difficulties of building them. The final type of narco subs are torpedoes. These tend to not be technologically advanced and are designed to be dragged by a camouflaged ship. In the event of detection, the tow ship can drop the torpedo, which then activates a homing signal for later retrieval when the coast is clear. Since 2015, there's been an increase in the number of narco subs being built and used. Consumer demand for cocaine is high, business is booming, and coca production in Colombia is soaring. In 2018, cocoa cultivation in Colombia stood at 208,000 hectares. That's 803 square miles of coca farms. Narco subs are especially preferred by Colombian drug cartel members to export cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, which is often then smuggled via land over the border into the U.S. During the summer of 2017, the Coast Guard caught 7 LVPs, seizing around 22,707 pounds of cocaine worth more than $306 million. In August and September of 2018, the Colombian Navy captured 14 semi-submersibles in the Pacific Ocean, more than 3 times the number of vessels captured in 2017. According to a U.S. Foreign Military Studies Office report, 80% of the drugs smuggled into the U.S. in 2012 came from maritime routes. 30% of the drugs that arrived in the U.S. by sea were transported via narco submarines. About 85% of the cocaine smuggling between South America and the U.S. takes place in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Authorities prefer to stop the drug smuggling on the ocean before it reaches land. because it reduces violence and maximizes the impact of cargo loss. When a narco sub successfully transports a load, upon arrival the drug packages are immediately broken into smaller loads for distribution, which are much harder to detect. As dispersal happens, the potential for violent incidents to occur rises. Currently, the U.S. Coast Guard is only managing to stop an estimated 11% of the vessels that pass through the East Pacific. The authorities have visibility on the majority of smuggling traffic, but don't have the capacity to address all the nefarious activity. Exacerbating the issue is the fact that the Pacific Ocean is huge, about the same size as the contiguous U.S., and the Coast Guard has a limited number of boats for patrolling. At any given time, 6 to 10 ships are on watch. Furthermore, 70% of the Coast Guard fleet is over 50 years old. Some of the aging boats are slower and require a lot of upkeep to be mission-ready. Even when the Coast Guard does manage to catch a narco sub, they have to move fast. The vessels have built-in valves that allow for purposeful dumping of drug evidence into the ocean and also sinking of the vessels to avoid seizure. The smugglers know that the Coast Guard will not allow them to drown. Originally, per maritime law, smugglers had to be rescued and released without criminal charges, usually back to their country of origin if there was no physical evidence of wrongdoing. In 2008, the U.S. Drug Trafficking Vessel Interdiction Act was enacted to close this legal loophole. It's now easier to prosecute smugglers in narco submarines whether they're caught with illicit product or not. Convicted smugglers are punished with prison terms of up to 20 years in the U.S. The June 18th seizure was one of 14 interdictions that took place during a month-long drug operation in international waters in the East Pacific. During the mission, over 39,000 pounds of cocaine and 933 pounds of marijuana, worth over $569 million, ended up being seized by the Monroe and 2 other Coast Guard cutters. In honor of the successful mission, several dignitaries attended a narcotics off-boarding event hosted on Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech welcoming the Coasties home and praising a job well done. The stealthy and deadly attack submarine, every seaman's worst nightmare since World War I. These are the weapons navies fear the most, and despite investing billions of dollars into locating, tracking, and targeting these underwater assassins, the navies of the world are still largely at the mercy of these silent killers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today, we're taking a look at the top 10 underwater killers in top 10 attack submarines in the world. Number 10. Oscar II class, Russia. Originally entering service in 1986, the Oscar II class are still Russia's most capable submarines. Designed to counter the threat of U.S. carrier battle groups, Oscar IIs were the pinnacle of modern Soviet engineering, and the surviving boats have received numerous upgrades. Out of a planned 19 subs, only 11 were ever completed due to cost and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Armed with 24 P-700 Granite supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, these subs were a huge threat to surface vessels. A recent upgrade to one of the remaining Oscar IIs of P-800 Onyx missiles also gives them the ability to target coastal installations and are even more lethal versus surface vessels. To destroy enemy submarines, Oscar II subs are equipped with 2 650mm and 4 533mm torpedo tubes that can fire both torpedoes and anti-ship missiles. Further equipment includes nuclear warheads and nuclear depth charges against surface ships or submarines. Unfortunately, Oscar IIs are fairly noisy boats and must lay in wait for a target to get near them before launching a surprise attack for fear of detection. Also, most of Russia's remaining Oscar IIs are nearing the end of their service life and will soon be retired, with no replacement planned for Russia's submarine fleet. Number 9. Ohio class, USA. First entering service in 1981 as a nuclear ballistic missile submarine, the U.S.'s Ohio class has seen a number of its boats converted for anti-ship and land attack roles by replacing its nuclear armaments with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Though still the U.S. Navy's only nuclear ballistic missile submarine and over 30 years old, the Ohio remains a formidable threat that can silently loiter in remote areas of the world or near U.S. shores while remaining in range of its assigned nuclear targets, thanks to its Trident II D5 nuclear missile's exceptional range. This makes an Ohio-class submarine virtually impossible to defend from, and the most survivable part of the U.S.'s nuclear triad. After the fall of the Soviet Union and several nuclear arms reduction treaties though, 4 of the Ohio-class's 18 boats have been refitted with cruise missiles and pack 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles, or as much firepower as an entire surface battle group. The U.S.'s new generation of ballistic missile submarines, the Columbia class, is currently under development and will enter service in 2031. Number 8. Soryu class, Japan. Not typically known for their endurance, the Soryu class is a diesel-powered submarine with an air-independent propulsion system that allows it to operate submerged for weeks rather than days as a traditional diesel-powered sub. Because nuclear submarines need coolant to be constantly pumped through their reactors, which generates noise, diesel-powered submarines can be far stealthier by running on diesel at the surface long enough to fully charge their onboard batteries, and then diving to operate for days on battery power alone. Japan's Soryu class uses a Swedish-designed air-independent propulsion system. However, that allows it to operate its diesel engines even while fully submerged, greatly increasing its endurance. Though smaller than most other attack submarines at only 285 feet in length, Japan's Soryu class's deft maneuverability allows them to operate extremely close to the shore and hug the bottom of shallow water, making them the perfect defenders of the island nation. Number 7. Akula class, Russia. The largest submarines ever built, the legendary Akula class were originally deployed in 1986 and took the West by complete surprise, with most Western observers not thinking the Soviet Union had the technical expertise to develop such an advanced submarine for at least another decade. At 367 feet, Russia's Akulas remain the largest submarines ever launched. The Akulas used commercially available Western tech in order to reduce noise levels on board, a move which led to restrictions on the sale and lease of certain submarine technologies amongst NATO nations. Equipped with both anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, and nuclear ballistic missiles, Akulas remain a formidable threat even if only 4 remain in service with the Russian Navy. Number 6. Improved Los Angeles class, USA. The most prolific submarine class in the world, the Los Angeles class of nuclear attack submarines have prowled the world's oceans since 1978. With over 40 hulls serving alongside Seawolf and the new Virginia-class subs, the U.S.'s fleet of Los Angeles-class submarines is a powerful deterrent to any would-be adversary. Initially outfoxed by a Soviet counterpart during initial Alpha 1 deployment, improvements to both propulsion and its tracking and targeting systems quickly saw the Los Angeles class overtake its Soviet counterparts, prompting the development of new Soviet submarine designs. Armed with Tomahawk land attack missiles, anti-ship missiles, and torpedoes, a Los Angeles-class submarine is an all-around threat and has undertaken missions ranging from anti-submarine patrols to strike missions against Iraqi ground targets in both Gulf Wars. Number 5. Sierra II class, Russia. Amongst the most expensive and deep diving of Russian submarines, the Sierra II class or Project 945A Condor class were the successor to the Sierra I class. With a double hull made of titanium, the Sierra II featured great noise reduction over its predecessor and increased resistance to torpedo attacks. Soviet titanium manufacturing and welding technology was far in advance of the West at the time of the Sierra II's production, but the material was far more expensive to work with and skyrocketed the cost of Sierra IIs just as the Soviet Union began to disintegrate. Replaced by the cheaper Akula class, they remain among one of the best-made Russian submarines and one of the best attack submarines ever deployed. Number 4. Grainy class, Russia. The successor to the Akula-class submarines, the Grainy or Project 855 Yasin class of subs is Russia's newest nuclear attack submarine. With the original of its class laid down in 1993, funding problems following the Soviet collapse led to a cancellation of further construction until 2003. The first of its class was finally delivered to the Russian Navy in 2013 and remains the only commissioned boat of its type in active service. In 2017, a second Grainy was completed but is yet to officially join the Russian naval service. Armed with vertical launch tubes for anti-ship missiles and land attack cruise missiles, Grainies will be able to target both surface vessels such as American carrier groups and coastal targets. Grainies are also armed with torpedoes for both anti-sub and anti-ship attack, but can have their torpedoes replaced with mines. Though more advanced than the Akula, which it replaces, the Grainy class is only slightly quieter than the Akula, highlighting Russia's difficulties in mastering undersea's acoustic silencing technologies. To further compound the Russian Navy's problems, only 4 more ships of its type have been ordered, with no plans for more, severely limiting Russia's submarine capabilities. Number 3. Astute class, Great Britain. With its vaunted Swiftsure class of nuclear-powered submarines nearing the end of their service lives, the Astute class is both a much-needed replacement for the British Navy and a huge technological leap forward. Astutes feature advanced data processing capabilities, combining brains with a considerable brawn in the form of a complement of 36 torpedoes, or a mix of torpedoes and anti-ship harpoon missiles. In addition, Astutes can be loaded with Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles for striking deep into enemy territory, and mines can replace its torpedo complement for mining operations in hostile or contested waters. 4 Astutes are currently in service, with plans for a total force of 7 by 2024. Number 2. Virginia class, USA. The U.S. Navy's newest attack submarine, the Virginia class, is the replacement for the venerable Los Angeles class fleet currently in service. Designed as a smaller and cheaper alternative to the Seawolf class, the Virginia class is equipped for the realities of a new world order, where the threat of the full-scale war against the Soviet bloc is no longer a reality. A multi-mission platform, Virginias will be able to fulfill the traditional anti-shipping role of submarines, while also engaging in reconnaissance, land attack, and even special operations missions. It is the first U.S. submarine to employ a built-in Navy SEAL staging area that will allow a team of 9 Navy SEALs to enter and leave the submarine while still submerged. Virginias will also be capable of carrying a new nuclear variant of the Tomahawk cruise missile, allowing them to carry out nuclear deterrence missiles as well. With 14 currently in service and a further 16 on order, the Virginia class will ensure the U.S. Navy retains its underwater edge for decades to come. Number 1. Seawolf class, USA. In the mid-1980s, the U.S. faced an erosion of its technological edge over the Soviets due to espionage and the trading of submarine silencing technology by various partners and allies. Determined to reclaim their underwater dominance, the U.S. developed and launched the Seawolf class, the most advanced submarine ever built, described as 10 times quieter than the improved Los Angeles class and 70 times as quiet as the original Los Angeles class. A Seawolf can cruise at 20 knots and still be nearly impossible to locate, whereas most other subs must cruise no faster than 5 knots or give their positions away. It's said that a Seawolf cruising at 25 knots is still quieter than a Los Angeles-class sub tied up at its pier. Packing a whopping 8 torpedo tubes in a double-decked torpedo room, the Seawolf can engage multiple targets simultaneously, a reality that it would have likely faced in a real war against the Soviet bloc, as the Seawolf's price tag would have made large numbers of them impossible to field. At $33.6 billion, the Seawolf class made up 25% of the U.S. Navy's construction budget in 1991 and was the most expensive naval weapons program in history. Due to the high costs and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Seawolf was eventually limited to just 3 in total. Despite its overwhelming underwater superiority, the New World Order simply didn't warrant the hefty price tag. Yet the 3 Seawolves first entering service in 1997, 1998, and 2005 are projected to remain in service for years to come yet, still unmatched by anything in the ocean to include the U.S.'s new Virginia class. Just off the coast of California, a hunt is underway. American cruisers and the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier ply the deep Pacific waters, and underneath, a Los Angeles-class nuclear attack sub prowls for its quarry. Overhead, anti-submarine warfare helicopters buzz around the carrier battle group, routinely stopping to dip their hanging sonar into the water and listen for the sub everyone is hunting for. Poseidon aircraft fly overhead, their powerful magnetic anomaly sensors scouring the sea beneath the big planes. Thousands of eyes are glued to electronic screens or scouring the sea with binoculars. Just 3 miles away from the mighty USS Ronald Reagan, a slender periscope breaks the surface. It snaps 4 photos of the big aircraft carrier and then sinks once more beneath the waves. Its mission has been achieved. The tiny Swedish submarine has successfully penetrated all the various layers of American anti-submarine defense and scored a simulated hit on the Ronald Reagan. This wargame occurred in 2005 after the U.S. Navy struck a deal with Sweden to lease the submarine and her crew for participation in major anti-submarine warfare wargames. If the scenario had been a real wartime condition, the small Gotland-class submarine would have definitely scored hits on the Ronald Reagan. Though with her relatively small torpedoes and limited number of launch tubes, it's unlikely the massive Reagan would have been sunk or even declared a mission kill. Still, when you're operating the world's largest supercarriers and each carrier is home to more firepower than many countries' entire air forces, you don't want to be taking unnecessary risks. The bigger question, however, is how did this small Swedish sub even manage to penetrate through the many rings of security supposed to protect the most powerful warships in the world? Immediately after the end of World War II, a fierce debate over the future of American firepower erupted at the highest levels of military leadership. The U.S. Navy insisted that big aircraft carriers were the best tools for projecting American firepower, while the newly created Air Force insisted that its B-36 long-range bomber program was in fact the best fit. After many hearings, Congress eventually sided with the Air Force, and a planned expansion of aircraft carriers was canceled. However, during the Korean War, the close air support made available by aircraft carrier assets convinced the country that aircraft carriers were indeed a critical way of projecting power forward, and a new emphasis on their construction began. As the Cold War evolved, the Soviet Union greatly feared the growing threat of American carriers. Once the U.S. developed nuclear weapons small enough to be equipped by carrier-based planes, those fears were intensified. This led them to aggressively pursue the use of nuclear submarines in order to hunt and kill American carriers in the event of war. The U.S. was well aware of this threat, and its intelligence on Soviet subs was far better than the Soviet Union ever truly knew. Thus, America quickly developed the most robust anti-submarine warfare capability in the world, and the U.S. was so confident it could defeat Soviet subs that aircraft carriers played prominent roles in warplane offensives against the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended, though, the U.S. Navy found itself armed to the teeth for a war that never came, and with no significant opponent that could match the level of readiness that the Soviet Union had forced the U.S. Navy to maintain. China was a growing problem, but its Navy was and remains today decades behind the capabilities of the U.S., and its own submarines are so notoriously loud that sonar operators have described Chinese subs as washing machines being dragged behind a pickup truck down a gravel road. With no significant threat to American carriers, the U.S. anti-submarine warfare capabilities began to atrophy, and this only worsened with the retirement of the S-3 Viking patrol aircraft and the Oliver Hazard Perry class of frigates, both key tools in the Cold War Navy's anti-submarine warfare toolkit. To make matters worse, the launch of the dual wars in Iraq and Afghanistan saw the Navy shift its focus from blue water naval operations to coastal support roles, lending their surface and undersea firepower to land units in need of fire support. Budgets and technology were invested in giving Navy vessels improved ability to target and destroy land targets, and better support ongoing shore-based operations. Under the waves, though, the American subfleet was being slowly neglected, and it wouldn't be until President Obama's second term that a big investment in submarine purchases would see a growing gap in available vessels finally start to shrink. By 2005, it was growing increasingly obvious that China wasn't content to let the current balance of power in the South Pacific rest as it had for decades, and its aggressive and illegal seizure of maritime territory belonging to its neighbors proved to the U.S. that China could very quickly become the U.S. Navy's public enemy number one. While Chinese submarines were decades behind in stealth technology, many international shipbuilders were starting to produce new modes of diesel-electric submarines that could threaten America's big carriers. Despite these threats, the U.S. Navy had allowed its anti-submarine warfare capabilities to atrophy to disastrous levels. It was time to make a change. First, though, the U.S. Navy had to determine what kind of a threat these new air-independent diesel-electric submarines posed to modern carriers. A relatively new development, air-independent diesel-electric subs bridged the endurance gap between nuclear submarines and traditional diesel subs. Nuclear submarines are notoriously difficult to run silently, and the U.S. Navy has spent billions on research into quieting the many very noisy systems that keep a nuclear reactor running smoothly. The constant need for water as a coolant to be pumped into the reactor, for instance, is one hurdle that the U.S. Navy has long cleared, but navies such as Russia's own never quite did. China, for all intents and purposes, never even made it out of the starting block in this regard. By comparison though, a diesel-electric submarine runs perfectly silent when it's underwater. That's because these subs use air-breathing diesel engines while on the surface of the ocean to charge massive banks of batteries, and then turn their engines off and cruise the depths on battery power alone, completely eliminating all the potential noise of a nuclear sub. Yet this ability comes with the obvious drawback that a diesel sub will very quickly have to resurface in order to run its engines and replenish its batteries. And this has traditionally limited the endurance of diesel subs to just days. A new development in diesel submarines, though, has resulted in what's known as air-independent propulsion systems, in which the diesel engines can still be run even while underwater. Typically, liquid oxygen is mixed with an inert gas and pumped into the engines so that they can burn the diesel as fuel, and then waste gases are vented into the ocean. Thus, this new generation of diesel subs can recharge their batteries while underwater and not give themselves away by having to resurface every 2 to 3 days. An AIP diesel sub can have an endurance of up to 2 weeks, which is far and away better than any other diesel submarine to date. This increased endurance has made diesel submarines a threat to ships operating in deep waters, as in the past there was little threat from diesel subs getting anywhere near the depths that an aircraft carrier might operate from, as they simply didn't have the endurance. Now, AIP diesel subs offer a cheap alternative to nations wishing to build a fleet capable of striking in deep waters, with an AIP diesel sub running anywhere from $100 to $500 million, or about a quarter the price of a nuclear submarine. In 2005, the US got to see for itself just how effective these small lethal boats were, and though details of the war games remain classified, it's rumored that the Gotland and its Swedish crew managed to score many hits and even some kills on US vessels during the 1 year it was on lease to the US. In fact, the United States went so far as to lease the sub and its crew for an additional year, as it carefully studied the capabilities of the sub and developed strategies to defeat this new generation of quiet, stealthy diesel-electric subs. The result of the 2 years of war games was an increased focus on America's seriously flagging anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and the development of new tools such as autonomous sub-hunting drone ships now in active duty service. With the threat of a possible conflict with China in the South China Sea, the US Navy is no longer taking any chances in the realm of undersea warfare, and its traditional edge on anti-submarine warfare is once more being honed. Yet, just how vulnerable are big ships, such as modern supercarriers, to this new generation of small, stealthy diesel-electric subs? Well, even the best-equipped navy in the world is going to have trouble dealing with submarines. It's notoriously difficult to locate and track submarines beneath the waves, and thus the best defense that a modern carrier has is to simply stay on the move at all times. An American supercarrier has a cruising speed of about 35 knots, which is approximately the top speed of most submarines. By staying on the move, a sub will have a very difficult time getting close enough to get a firing solution, or will have to burn up its fuel or energy reserves in order to keep up. For a nuclear-powered sub, this isn't a problem, but for a diesel-electric submarine, this poses a huge issue, and is the reason why the US Navy has always opted for nuclear power. Yet, a diesel-electric sub such as Sweden's Gotland doesn't have to catch up with a carrier if it can instead simply wait in the direct path. This might be tough for a country with a small submarine fleet such as Sweden to do in a real war, as aircraft carriers routinely make abrupt course adjustments for just this reason. Yet a large enough group of submarines could potentially spread out over enough area that the big carrier will eventually be moving in one of their directions. With its engines powered off and resting still and silent, a submarine is practically undetectable, and it can simply sit still and wait until it has a firing solution on the approaching carrier, fire off its torpedoes, and then quickly make its escape. Smaller submarines such as the Gotland and its limited number of torpedo tubes and smaller warheads are unlikely to destroy a big supercarrier, as they would be detected immediately upon opening fire and sunk themselves in return if they didn't flee as soon as they launched their opening volley. Yet, larger diesel-electric subs can carry more torpedo tubes with larger warheads, and these pose a significant threat to big surface ships. Not impossible to detect or defend from by any means, small, cheap diesel-electric submarines nevertheless pose a significant threat to any surface ship, and especially so when a navy has allowed its anti-submarine warfare training and capabilities both to atrophy. The date is 1943, and just a little under a year ago, the United States was rocked by a surprise attack against its most important naval base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. Many ships were destroyed, more were seriously damaged, and while the Japanese failed in their objective to destroy the US Pacific carrier fleet, they did succeed in knocking the US Navy out of the fight for the foreseeable future. Unable to muster a surface fleet large enough to challenge the Japanese Navy, the United States has instead dispatched the one part of its Pacific Fleet completely unaffected by the surprise attack, the American Silent Service, a submarine fleet made up of dozens of silent killers. For months, they've enacted their own revenge on the Japanese, slipping past their pickets of destroyers and corvettes to strike at the vulnerable merchant shipping fleet that all too often travels unaccompanied by armed escorts. The US has sunk tens of thousands of tons of shipping in the first 6 months of the war, and the undersea campaign has only just begun. Aboard the USS Seawolf, Captain Frederick B. Warder keeps his eyes glued to the submarine's periscope. This is his 7th patrol since the war started, and technically will be his last as a submarine commander. After this final patrol, he'll return back to a US naval station somewhere and be placed in command of a portion of the US's submarine fleet in the Pacific, giving orders from a safe office somewhere rather than the bridge of a sub deep in enemy territory. Warder could have finished his patrol quietly, having finished his assigned patrol route and on his way back home. However, he had several torpedoes in his hold, and going back home with live fish didn't sit right with any submarine commander in the US Navy. On a hunch, he decided to investigate a deep-water anchorage on a small island near the Philippines, hoping to run into stray Japanese ships and expend his remaining torpedoes before sailing for home. What he finds is the opportunity of a lifetime. Sitting at anchor are 4 Japanese cruisers lined up side by side next to each other. The Japanese have built a small naval station here, which will be good intel to share with the command later. And along with the cruisers are several merchant marine ships. By now, he's sunk many merchant marine ships, ensuring that the vital flow of fuel, ammunition, and food would fail to reach stranded Japanese troops across the Pacific. The cruisers are the real target here, and with 4 of them lined up in a row, he knows he'll never have an opportunity like this again. A fitting end to his final patrol. Submarines rarely ever attack Japanese combat ships as the risks are simply too great. Destroyers, cruisers, and especially corvettes simply have too shallow a draft, and torpedoes need to be aimed perfectly or will more often than not miss their target and detonate too far away to do any damage. That's if the damn things even worked right in the first place. On his first combat patrol just a single day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Warder and his USS Seawolf took on a load of torpedoes from a Philippine base. The day after that, he fired on a Japanese vessel, getting 2 direct hits, which did absolutely nothing. Both torpedoes failed to detonate, and one managed to get itself lodged in the ship instead. The third torpedo he was grateful hadn't detonated, as it had suffered a malfunction common to early American torpedoes and swam back around to its launch point, making a big circle. If he hadn't given the order to dive, the torpedo would have rammed his hull as well. Though with the luck he was having, this one probably would have actually detonated. The torpedo problems were hardly unique to Warder. The American Mark 14 torpedo had one of the best propulsion systems in the world at the time, but suffered from a great many other defects that made it all but useless in battle. 2 of the biggest problems was its electromagnetic detector, which was designed to sense the magnetic hull of a ship and explode when the torpedo arrived at its closest point to the hull. In order to do this, the detector would track a series of electronic signals that would fire more and more rapidly the closer the torpedo came to the hull, and then slow down as it traveled away from the enemy ship's hull. That way, as soon as the signals began to slow rather than increase, the detector would order the warhead to explode. Unfortunately, while this had worked perfectly in testing on the Great Lakes, anomalies around the equator and in the Pacific severely compromised the detector. The second major problem with the Mark 14 torpedo was its depth gauge, which would incorrectly read water pressure to tell the torpedo it was traveling at a depth greater than it really was. This caused the torpedo to dive by as much as 20 feet, completely missing its intended target. While problems plagued the torpedo, Naval Command was reluctant to accept something was wrong with the weapon. To help pressure a decision to overhaul the weapon, early in the war, Warder had held his sub's position even while under enemy fire, in order to record the effects of 2 of his dud torpedoes on an enemy ship. The footage nearly cost him his life, but it would help ensure that many more American submariners wouldn't be going into combat with duds in their hold. Today, though, Warder is not carrying duds. His fish are live and primed and combat tested. Any submariner would still prefer to avoid attacking enemy combat vessels who can fire back, as they're difficult targets to hit versus slow, broad-keeled merchant ships. But even just a year into the war, Japanese merchant ships are already becoming rare. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping has been devastatingly effective. The ships before him, though, are at anchor, and to his surprise, there's not a single vessel on patrol looking out for American subs. Warder decides to take the opportunity, knowing he would be poking the hornet's nest, and that any one of those ships or the many Japanese destroyers nearby could blow him out of the water with a single depth charge. Warder lines up his attack against one of the cruisers and fires off 2 torpedoes. The fish runs straight and true, and through the periscope, Warder watches the line of bubbles speeding directly at the enemy ship. Moments later, there are 2 explosions on the ship's stern, 2 direct hits. The crew give an excited shout, and then quickly quiet back down as the ship immediately dives. Above the waves, the Japanese ships are coming to life, and already small patrol boats are looking for the intruding American sub. As the Seawolf slowly sneaks out of the small cove, ships above begin to drop depth charges. Warder orders the boat forward at low power. He doesn't want to risk accelerating and giving his position away to any sonar operators aboard the Japanese ships. This does mean that he's exposed to the deadly rain of depth charges for longer though, and a few near misses shake the sub. Eventually though, he manages to escape to open ocean and safety. Warder carefully considers his next move. He still has a hold that's half full of torpedoes, and incredibly the Japanese have still not dispersed their fleet. The 3 surviving cruisers remain, and after an initial flurry of activity, other Japanese destroyers seem to have resumed their normal patrols. The ships inside the cove are still incredibly vulnerable, probably figuring that no American submarine commander would be insane enough to risk his life a second time. For Warder, there's no option. He orders the men to rest. Tomorrow before dawn, they will return and strike once more. There are now more Japanese ships on the lookout for subs, but the defensive screen is still surprisingly light and easy to penetrate. Silently, the Seawolf slips into a comfortable range of under 1,000 yards, takes her time to line up her shot, and fires 2 more torpedoes. Another Japanese cruiser is struck, and this one too will sink. Warder orders the Seawolf to dive once more, and once more the Japanese fleet begins to saturate the area with depth charges. There's more ships this time, and more depth charges, but for a second time the Seawolf manages to avoid being destroyed and makes for the safety of the open ocean. 2 days and 2 Japanese combat ships destroyed. In just this short campaign, Warder is already more successful than submarine captains over the course of multiple patrols. Sinking merchant ships is one thing after all, but sinking full-sized combat ships is another entirely, especially those armed with depth charges. He has 2 torpedoes left now, and Warder agonizes over his next choice. Does he press his luck, attempt another attack, or does he simply go home with 2 live fish in his hold? The opportunity to sink another Japanese combat ship weighs heavily on his mind, but so does the look on his men's faces. Most of them have accompanied him on all 7 patrols through the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. They've sunk many ships together, and they've cheated death on more occasions than he'd care to remember. Just like this is his last patrol, it will also be the final patrol for many of his men. Warder can't let the Japanese go though, not after what they did at Pearl Harbor. He decides to return and resume the hunt, determined to expend his last 2 torpedoes. The Japanese patrols are heavy on the 3rd day, having learned their lesson. Warder attempts to maneuver the Seawolf into the cove, but has to abort numerous times. The water's practically boiling with Japanese ships zipping back and forth, every one of them looking for Warder and his sub, and eager for revenge. Warder decides to back off and put out to sea once more. Now on the 3rd day of his campaign, he has to decide if he's going to try again tomorrow or let this go. His men are veterans, stalwart men of courage, the only type of man fit for a life beneath the waves, where any mistake could cost you your life. But he sees the fear etched on each man's face. He can see the exhaustion. The men are nearing their breaking point. They want to go home, but they believe in their captain. Warder decides to press the attack once more. The Japanese patrols have slacked only slightly, but this lapse is enough to give Warder the opening he needs. He maneuvers the Seawolf into the cove once more. Surely, no Japanese sailor would ever believe that an American would be crazy enough to attempt a 3rd attack. What Warder does next, though, is insane even by his own standards. There, slowly steaming along, is a large Japanese cruiser, and from its mast is flying the pendant of a Japanese squadron commander, the flagship of this detachment. Warder has his target. He spends 30 minutes slowly maneuvering into position, narrowly avoiding detection by the swarm of ships above. Every Japanese sailor in 100 miles has their eyes peeled and ears glued to a sonar, it seems. Warder risks raising the periscope, hoping that as it breaks over the waves, some sharp-eyed sailor won't spot it. He lifts it only long enough to confirm the target. and then gives the order to fire. Two fish scream through the water, closing range to the Japanese squadron commander's flagship. In less than half a minute, twin detonations rock the big ship. Secondary explosions from stored munitions further adding to the chaos and destruction. Warder, however, is already deep beneath the waves, putting as much distance between himself and the Japanese as possible. The Japanese fleet is furious, and a dozen destroyers and cruisers scour the ocean for the Seawolf. They drop seemingly endless barrages of depth charges, and the Seawolf is subjected to an incredible 9-hour depth charge barrage, the longest of any American submarine, perhaps the longest of any submarine ever. Many of the hits are close enough to rock the small sub, some are close enough to rattle the teeth inside Warder's skull. The men hold, though Warder knows that he's driven them very close to the breaking point. The mission is over, and in his final patrol, Warder has scored his greatest victories. Warder's men would go on to give him the nickname of Fearless Freddie for his stunt in that small cove in the Pacific, a name that he would distinctly dislike. As he would explain in later interviews after the war, he was never fearless. He was just as afraid as any one of his sailors, and implying he was fearless, he felt took away from the courage of the men he served with. That attitude would perhaps best exemplify the character of Rear Admiral Frederick Warder, though. A man brave in combat but humble in victory. Not only did he care deeply for the men under his command, but would often show compassion even to the Japanese whose ships he sunk, ordering his sub to surface and offering to take in the stranded sailors. Thanks to a loyal fanaticism to the Emperor and the shame of defeat, not a single Japanese sailor took him up on that offer, and so instead Warder ordered his men to toss the stranded sailors supplies and life jackets. To Admiral Warder, all men were ultimately brothers, even if they happened to be on opposite sides of the battlefield. Trapped at the bottom of the Barents Sea, distraught Russian Navy personnel are in a fight to survive as one catastrophe follows another on board their embattled submarine. Each of those men is faced with unimaginable terror. As time passes, the highest echelons of Russian officialdom will lie through their teeth and exhibit startling ineptitude. This will become one of the hardest periods in Vladimir Putin's entire life, and that's saying something. The story begins on August 10, 2000, when the Russian nuclear submarine K-141 Kursk was engaged in naval exercises in the Barents Sea. The Kursk belonged to the Oscar II class submarine commissioned during the height of the Cold War, designed to take out large enemy ships or aircraft carriers. The Oscar II was powered by an OK-650 nuclear reactor, giving it 97,990 shipboard horsepower and a speed of up to 33 knots when fully submerged. On board, each sub carried 24 P-700 Granite missiles, which NATO had given the name SSN-19 Shipwreck. Shipwreck indeed. These things were 33 feet long, weighing 15,400 pounds, capable of Mach 1.6 speeds, with a range of 388 miles. They could carry conventional high-explosive warheads, but also a 500-kiloton warhead, enough to turn any American ship to dust. These subs were a grand achievement for the Soviets and a major threat to the U.S. Navy. The Kursk was first launched post-Cold War in 1994, but due to a lack of funds for fuel, it rarely saw any action, despite it being one of Russia's most outstanding military machines. The Kursk was so big, as long as 2 jumbo jets, that there were staterooms for each senior officer. The crew, who back then were paid peanuts if they were paid at all, could enjoy a gymnasium. Although unlike the giant Typhoon class, there was no sauna or solarium for those long deployments beneath the sea. Still, the Kursk was a massive piece of machinery, complete with 10 separate compartments that could be separated in case something awful should happen. Like the Titanic, the Kursk was called unsinkable, but also, like the Titanic, it definitely was sinkable. In 1999, it was deployed in the Mediterranean Sea with the task of monitoring the United States 6th Fleet that was responding to the crisis in Kosovo at the time. But for the most part, the Kursk remained unemployed, which meant time gathering dust and crews unable to gain experience on it. In 2000, the Kursk was once again asked to perform. That was after a decade out of action. Not counting that short Kosovo deployment, it was time to take part in a large-scale naval exercise, which the Russians named the Summer X exercise, the biggest naval exercise for many years, costing millions of dollars. It would include 30 Russian ships, including the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov and the battlecruiser Pyotr Velikhetya. Unknown to the Russians, monitoring the exercise were 2 American submarines, the SS Toledo and the SS Memphis, along with U.S. surface ships and U.S. and Norwegian aircraft monitoring from the skies. The crew on the Kursk was said to be the best in Russia's northern fleet, manning a submarine that was fully armed with Granite missiles and torpedoes and was to make a simulated attack on the Kuznetsov. There were no nuclear weapons on board, however. The Kursk's personnel consisted of Captain First Rank Gennady Pilyuchin, along with 111 crew members, 5 officers of the 7th SSGN Division headquarters, and 2 designers. The first day, the 10th, went fine. The Kursk launched a granite missile armed with a dummy warhead. The mission was a success. On the 12th, the plan was to launch more dummy torpedoes, but this time at the Wallachia. At about 8:51 a.m., from the flagship Peter the Great, Fleet Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, commander of the Northern Fleet, radioed the Kursk to fire the torpedo. The last word Popov said was good. The launch was good to go. That was the last time the Kursk radioed anyone, although it wouldn't be the last communication from the Kursk. At 11:28 a.m., there was an explosion. The USS Memphis, still monitoring the exercise, picked up the explosion, which was soon followed by a second larger explosion. The explosions rocked the entire exercise area, especially the second one. Our Norwegian seismic monitoring station recorded both. The Peter Wallachia, the 28,000-ton battlecruiser, shook at its rudder. That second explosion had measured a 4.2 on the Richter scale, so it was in fact recorded all over Europe. It was about 250 times more powerful than the initial explosion, powerful enough that seismic stations in Canada and Alaska also recorded the shockwave. The Russian submarine, the Karelia, was also monitoring the exercise and felt the shockwaves. It was obvious to the Americans and the Norwegians that something serious had happened, but for the moment the Russians weren't overly concerned. The shockwaves were reported to top military brass, but at first these reports were ignored. There was radio silence, but Popov, who was accustomed to breakdowns of communications equipment, wasn't worried just yet. As time passed and radio silence remained, his concern grew. The Northern Fleet headquarters sent another radio message to Kursk. Report your coordinates and operations. No answer. The Russians then dispatched a helicopter to see if the submarine had risen to the surface, but reported back negative. At 6:30 p.m., the Russians set up a search and rescue post. Soon after, 2 Il-38 searching aircraft were also dispatched, returning sometime later to the airfield, having not seen anything. The Russians still had no idea what had happened, but they were now more than a bit concerned. Captain Alexander Teslenko, who was in charge of Russia's search and rescue mission, ordered the Mikhail Rudnitsky to be dispatched to look for the Kursk. This was a 20-year-old lumber carrier that had been converted for submersible rescue operations. The Rudnitsky was equipped with 2 AS-32 and AS-34 Priz-class deep submergence rescue vehicles. The ship was also carrying a diving bell, lifting cranes, and gear for underwater rescues. But importantly, it wasn't equipped with specialized stabilizers that could keep it in position in stormy weather. As luck would have it, the weather was about to make a turn for the worst, and the Rudnitsky was not up for the job. We can call this mistake number 1, although in all honesty mistakes had been made long before the Kursk was put out to sea. The Russians actually had 2 India-class rescue submarines, and each of those had small rescue submarines capable of reaching a depth of 2,275 feet. But back in 1995, these were put out of action. They were waiting for repairs in St. Petersburg at the time of the disaster. This was post-Cold War, when Russia's finances were extremely tight. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. that the Northern Fleet declared an emergency. It was only then that the naval exercise was properly shut down. Around 20 ships belonging to the Northern Fleet, including about 3,000 sailors, were tasked with search efforts. All of this was fastidiously recorded. One log tells us, 7 p.m., 0.8 kilograms of delicacy canned food, cod liver in its own juice, was issued to the officers' war room. Rescuers started watching artistic videos. It was only the next morning at about 7 a.m. that Popov had told the Kremlin that they had a possible catastrophe on their hands. The vessel had been found on the seabed, but it wasn't certain if the men were alive in it. The Minister of Defense, Igor Sergeyev, told Vladimir Putin that Sunday morning, but informed the new boss that he shouldn't go to the disaster site. This is where things got strange. The Russian Navy commander, Admiral Vladimir Kuryadev, said at one point that there had been signs of a big and serious collision. Kuryadev later admitted the chances for a positive outcome are not very high. But collided with what exactly? The U.S. Department of Defense, which as you know had been monitoring the exercise, stated that there was no indication that a U.S. vessel was involved in the accident. The U.S. believed there had been an explosion, but it couldn't be ascertained what had caused it. Even though the Russians knew this was now potentially a large-scale catastrophe, Popov spoke to the public that Sunday and called the mission a resounding success. He almost certainly knew at the time that something resoundingly cataclysmic had happened. In reports that followed, the public heard that there had been some minor technical difficulties, but everyone on board is alive. No one knew that, however. Like Chernobyl many years earlier, the Russian bigwigs were keeping this under wraps for as long as possible. It was only on Monday that the Russians publicly admitted that the Kursk was in serious trouble, but even then, the families of the men on the ship were not told anything that resembled the truth. They were also told that the accident happened on Sunday when it happened on Saturday. Attempts to reach the sub were aborted many times. At this point, the Americans, as well as France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Norway, and Britain, all believed something grave had happened. When they contacted the Russians, they were told the rescue was going fine. Russia refused any assistance. The Russian public certainly didn't want to hear about this, as 118 fine young men were potentially sitting on the seabed 354 feet down. The weather got even worse, so the search was hampered by poor visibility. There was still some hope, although by now the wives and relatives of the men were hearing horrible rumors. They weren't getting the truth from the government or the Navy, but word was getting around that their loved ones on that sub were never coming back. The news was getting out to Russian journalists who were using every trick in the book to get their story, bribing officials and even pretending to be part of a rescue team. The families kept being told that all attempts to save the men were being made, but what they weren't being informed about is that many attempts to get the sub were being botched. The equipment wasn't good enough for the job. The bad weather was also playing a big part in making things much harder. At times, the diving bell was thrown around by powerful undersea currents. Things went from bad to worse. One time, one of the rescue vehicles was broken when it was being loaded back into the ship. It was a nightmare scenario for all involved. On further attempts, even when they could get to the sub, they couldn't attach the diving bell. Time was running out. It was estimated that the men on the submarine could possibly have enough air until the 18th. That's what the families heard, but later they were told differently, that the men could survive longer. It was on the 18th that the British and Norwegians were finally allowed to join the search. The family still had no idea what was going on. Sometimes reports stated that the crew was sending SOS messages by tapping on the sub. Hearing the little taps of SOS messages were coming from the Kursk was about the best news relatives had in days. But were those knocking sounds men or something hitting the sub from the outside? On the 19th, the Norwegian ship named the Normand Pioneer arrived on the scene carrying the British rescue submarine LR-5. Both the Norwegians and the British complained that the Russians were making their job harder. Vice Admiral E. Skorgen of the Norwegian Navy told a newspaper from time to time the information given to the Norwegian side was so inauthentic that it threatened the safety of the divers. At one point, the Russians discharged the Brits from the operation altogether, which Paddy Heron of the British team said was repugnant. The Russians were still embracing the secrecy of the Cold War in the year 2000, yet the relatives of the crew heard nothing of this. The Russians said the Brits and Norwegians were making the job impossible. The mood changed on Monday, August 21st at 7:45 a.m. when a Norwegian rescuer opened the upper door of an emergency hatch. He saw no people in the airlock. At 1 p.m., the hatch of the airlock was opened. The sub was completely flooded, and when the divers opened one of the compartments, they found dead bodies scattered everywhere. There were no signs of life anywhere they looked as they checked other compartments. Admiral Popov and Vice Admiral Skorgen had to accept the truth: everyone was dead. At 9 p.m. that night, the Military Council of the Northern Fleet officially reported the loss of all the crew. The families were informed, wives and children wept, but many were angered on how this whole operation had gone down. What they'd been told didn't make sense. Popov appeared on Russian TV and took off his cap, telling the cameras, "Forgive me for not saving your sailors." It still wasn't exactly certain who had died on the sub. Not all the names had been announced, although sneaky journalists bribed officials again, and soon the names appeared on TV. The Russian Federation asked Norway for further help with the removal of the sailors' bodies. The bodies of the dead were to be removed through 8 special holes that were made in the hull. Norway's Stolt offshore company signed a contract for between $5 to $7 million, because this was not going to be an easy operation. While they were in mourning, the relatives of the deceased heard more lies. Most of them were soon taken by the passenger ship Klavdia Yelenskaya to the scene of the incident and informed that absolutely all of the information and the condition of the site was made available to foreign specialists. That wasn't true in the least. The question was, had those foreigners been tasked with the job earlier, would they have found living humans on that sub? Had Russia's stalling cost lives? If it had, the Russian public would have crucified the military as well as the government. Military bigwigs were accused of incompetence. Instead of offering apologies, one of the generals called the journalist traitorous and the Navy personnel who'd spoken to them scum. This was a bad time for Russia and for Putin. In a poll, 60% of Russians said the disaster hadn't changed their support for him, but 27.8% said the disaster had diminished their support for him. Losing almost a third of your voter base in a matter of days isn't exactly great for a political leader. Putin soon discovered that his own military had misled him, something he would take out on them in the weeks to come. For now, he had to save his own face, and he did that by offering what the US reported was an unprecedented compensation package to the close relatives of the deceased. This amounted to an apartment and 720,000 rubles, or $26,000. All of the dead were honored with the Order of Valor, while victims got other goodies such as free telephone services and electricity. This was exceedingly generous, given the men were on about $600 a month, and as we mentioned before, many of them hadn't been paid in a while. Even with his public relations save, Putin struggled to wipe the pie from his face. Russia looked bad in the eyes of the world. He looked bad. The military looked totally incompetent. No amount of free phone calls was going to clean up this mess. Some of the widows were suspicious of the kindness. One widow told the press, "We get a lot more than Chechen widows, 10 times more. The Russian government doesn't give money out like that for nothing. There must be something they're trying to hide. They must feel guilty." Indeed, that question again emerged. Could those men have survived if the Russian Navy hadn't been so incompetent, or their equipment had been better, or more importantly, had Russia allowed the UK and Norway to help earlier in the rescue? Just how fast had those guys died, and what had killed them exactly? Just before we tell you this, you should know that what people were saying had happened prior to an official investigation. Of course, there were some wild theories in Russia and also in the West. The main hypothesis was a collision, and less so the sub hitting a World War II-era mine. Russian officials clung to the collision theory. Some other officials wondered if NATO had struck the sub. And the odd armchair expert believed that a mass poisoning on board or a new secret Russian weapon hitting the submarine led to the disaster. Some even speculated that it was a UFO attack. It seemed Russia was going with the collision story at first. On August 24th, the Russian main office of military prosecutor started proceedings against whoever had caused the accident. This was according to a clause 263.3 of the Russian Criminal Code, which related to violation of safety traffic regulations on railway, air, or water lines, entailed on carelessness, death of 2 or more persons. Guilty parties could be sent to prison for 4 to 10 years. The officials involved in these proceedings were all under the hammer, so it suited them that a collision rather than equipment faults and their incompetence had killed those men. The worst thing about this investigation was that they led it, their own hand-picked team. Outside investigators were persona non grata. It was high stakes for President Putin, too, faced with what the Washington Post called the first major political crisis of his presidency. These were the days when the US media actually liked Putin, a man some said that the US could do business with. For Putin, only 4 months into his presidency, this was life or death. He'd been roundly criticized for choosing to stay at a seaside resort at the start of the chaos, a public relations nightmare for a president when your country's in the middle of a disaster. When Putin did finally meet with about 350 relatives of the crew, journalists were not invited. Although some pretended to be relatives, many of the real relatives screamed at him, their eyes filled with tears and their mouths firing off every curse word under the Russian sun. It looked as though they were going to beat the hell out of him. They screamed, "Who killed our boys? Who will be punished?" Putin was under some serious pressure. One woman, Nadezhda Tylik, who was the mother of Kursk submariner Lieutenant Sergei Tylik, was absolutely enraged. She screamed at Putin and the other officials, "You better shoot yourselves now, we won't let you live." A nurse then sneaked up behind her and injected her with a sedative. This also became a controversy for Putin. At first, Nadezhda's husband claimed he'd asked the nurse to do that because she, his wife, was prone to excessive emotions. A few months later, Nadezhda told the truth. She said her husband had lied. He hadn't asked anyone for help. The nurse was part of the official gang. Nadezhda told the press, "The injection was done to shut my mouth. Immediately after it, I just lost the ability to speak and was carried out." She later told the St. Petersburg Times that Putin did not know how to respond to their questions. She added, "They told us lies the whole time, and even now, we're unable to get any information." The Western media picked up on the incident, saying it harkened back to the Cold War days. The Russian response was that it was nothing out of the ordinary. Regarding the Cold War-style injection, the Times newspaper in Britain was told by Russian officials, "We are simply protecting the relatives from undue pain. It was for her own protection." A Russian journalist later explained the likely reason why they knocked out Nadezhda. He said, "I honestly thought that they would tear him, Putin, apart. There was such a heavy atmosphere there, such a lot of hatred, despair, and pain. I never felt anything like it anywhere in my entire life." Much of the Russian media knew something was amiss, and many newspapers weren't afraid to say it. The Russian newspaper Izvestia wrote, "Lies and fears are the features of the Russian authority. When people's lives are involved, admirals, generals, and government officials should not lie, dodge, and think about their own career. This is blasphemy." The officials even took flack from retired Russian military bigwigs, one of whom, Yevgeny Ajnabayev, said, "It's become a form of theater. This is a performance for the whole world." Even though a Norwegian company had been contracted to get the dead out of there, the Russians told him that after they drilled the hole in the sub, only Russian divers were allowed inside. This suited the Russian officials, of course. When those Russian divers finally got inside the sub, they did so through compartment 9, although it was difficult to see as there was so much ash in the water. The Russians gradually worked their way through several compartments, greeted on their way by badly burned bodies. This didn't look like a collision. Russian officials were still selling the story that there'd been some sort of collision. They said the vessel had plummeted to the seabed, and everyone had pretty much died immediately. Some officials entertained the narrative that the collision had been with a NATO spying submarine. A few of them stuck with this tale for years after the accident, given that anti-Western propaganda was how they stayed in their job. But once the Russian divers found 12 bodies in compartment 9, they knew this had been no collision and the instant death of everyone. Those brave men in the compartment had not died straight away. They'd made their way to that compartment, but how long they were alive after the initial event was the question. Some said 3 days, which would mean they could have been rescued had the foreign teams been able to help earlier. The investigations went on for years, filling 133 volumes. The relatives were then told something that started to sound more like the truth, something that refuted the story that the men had survived more than a few hours in compartment 9. They were informed that the crew had tried to load a dummy torpedo for the training exercise, but a problem with the weld on the torpedo had led to a leak of high-test peroxide, which created an explosion. The torpedo manufacturer said outright that there was no way this could have happened. Still, that's the story that the Russian investigators stuck with, and it's the one that does make the most sense to anyone familiar with the story. They said the explosion started a fire and destroyed the bulkhead between the first and second compartments. They said this killed everyone in the control room or at least severely injured them. The much bigger second explosion was caused by 5 to 7 torpedo warheads going off as a result of the first explosion. The sailors people heard had blown themselves up. The second explosion completely wrecked the compartments and tore a massive hole in the hull. The nuclear reactors, it was said, shut down without any problems. Just about everyone was already dead after explosion 2, but 23 men managed to get to compartment 9, where they did indeed survive, but only for about 6 more hours, not a matter of days. It was said the oxygen they were breathing was depleted, so they tried to change to a potassium superoxide chemical oxygen cartridge, but it somehow fell into the oily water, and that blew up. Some more men were killed instantly, while others either died in the resulting fire or suffocated due to the fire consuming all of their oxygen. The only surviving notes from the sub were found in compartment 9. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov wrote in one note, "It's 13:15. All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. 23 people are here. We feel bad, weakened by carbon dioxide. Pressure is increasing in the compartment. If we head for the surface, we won't survive the compression. None of us can escape." 2 hours later, he wrote, "It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections who are now in the 9th and will attempt to get out. Regards to everyone, no need to despair. Kolesnikov." Russia's Izvestia newspaper reported that a note written inside a novel that was wrapped in plastic was found in the pocket of the deceased Lieutenant Commander Rashid Aryapov. The Russian rescue crew said the newspaper had taken the note when it was hoovering up secret documents. Part of it read, "Faults in the torpedo compartment, namely the explosion of a torpedo on which the Kursk had to carry out tests." This didn't, of course, gel with the collision theory the Russian government peddled for so long initially, which explains why the note went missing. So that was the story, but as you can imagine, it didn't exactly make the families of the dead men feel any better. They all asked what the BBC asked at the time. Why was the state-of-the-art nuclear submarine designed to withstand the full wrath of an enemy fleet so easily destroyed by a practice torpedo which didn't even have a warhead? And why had the torpedo, which was apparently leaking explosive fuel, not been checked properly? The northern Russian fleet admitted that some mistakes had been made. It was time for the government shuffle. Putin transferred Popyov and the fleet commander-chief of staff Mikhail Motsak. Igor Sergeyev resigned as Minister of Defense, and he was, for the first time in modern Russian history, replaced with someone not from the military, which apparently appalled other members of the military. Had the young Putin lost faith in his generals? During these shuffles, Putin made a point of saying that the collision theory was not true. Another proponent of that theory was Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov, who'd been sure a foreign sub had hit the Kursk. Putin demoted him to the Minister of Industry, Science and Technology. 12 high-ranking military officers got the boot, but in typical authoritarian style, Putin said it had nothing to do with the disaster. The relatives were still furious. They'd heard there'd been stunning breaches of discipline, shoddy, obsolete, and poorly maintained equipment, as well as negligence, incompetence, and mismanagement. Relatives became even more angered when they heard about the escape capsules on the Kursk, which evidently couldn't have been used. Then, Vice Admiral Valery Ryazantsev said the unsayable when he told the world those men on the sub were barely trained, while the sub had been poorly maintained and inspections had been infrequent, which was likely why the crew made the mistake that led to the initial explosion. The crew had been taught all the maintenance routines that had to happen before firing off a torpedo, but the Kursk hadn't fired one before that fateful day for 3 whole years. Books were written about the incident and documentaries were made. Even after the official theory had been presented, alternative theories spread through the internet like wildfire. People blamed the 2 Dagestani weapons specialists on board, saying they were actually Chechen terrorists. Russia was at war with Chechnya at the time of the incident and remained at war until 2009. There were other theories that the Russian government certainly didn't want to be proven true. According to the book Democratic Breakdown and the Decline of the Russian Military, some journalists in the West as well as inside Russia claimed that they had evidence that the Kursk had been blown up after the battlecruiser Petr Velikitya accidentally launched a torpedo at it. The Russian Navy called this an invention, and to this day it seems that's true. Even so, we'll never know for sure what caused the explosions. We know they happened, but we can't be sure why they happened. It could have been mutiny, it could have been an accidental attack. Once the government started lying, the theory started expanding. As that book we just mentioned stated, the dearth of credible information undoubtedly contributed to the many absurd conspiracy theories. In a poll in 2000, 79% of Russians interviewed ticked a box saying the government was hiding the reasons for the tragedy. Only 11% said they were confident the government was telling the truth. It's often said the late, great George Orwell once wrote, "In times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." It's a good quote to end our video with, but accrediting it to Orwell is itself probably part of a conspiracy theory. Submarines haunt the dreams of sailors around the world. Secretive, stealthy, and able to strike from out of nowhere, they remain the greatest threat to surface ships. Thankfully, submarines are limited in just how fast they can move, typically with a top speed of 29 miles per hour, which is well short of a typical destroyer's top speed of 40 miles per hour. Lagging behind their potential prey, submarines must typically intercept their targets or lurk in sea lanes and wait for an enemy to stumble into them. But what if subs could move much faster than they currently do? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at supersonic submarines, the US Navy's new superweapon. Moving underwater can be more difficult and energy-intensive than cruising along the surface, thanks to the huge amount of drag that water exerts on a vessel, and denser water a submarine encounters the deeper it dives. Thus, while speedboats can zip along the surface of the ocean at speeds of up to 90 miles per hour, anything traveling beneath the waves must exert exponentially larger amounts of energy to move as fast, something traditional submarines are incapable of doing. Yet, in June of this year, it was revealed that Chinese hackers had stolen sensitive data from a US contractor that had been working on a top-secret program to develop a supersonic missile to be launched from a submarine. While the data was only sensitive in nature and not classified, it did hint at a major avenue of research the US was undertaking, and hinted that the US Navy was not just interested in supersonic missiles, but supersonic submarines as well. For US-China observers though, the revelation was no surprise, as in 2014 China had made claims of huge technological breakthroughs in developing their own supersonic submarines. But just how can you move a submarine through the water at supersonic speeds without huge amounts of energy or absolutely destroying the ship in the first place? Let's take a look at both the US and China's approach to the problem. The US proposal involves doing something called supercavitation, a technology that the Soviet Union developed in the 1960s for superfast torpedoes. The Soviet approach to moving a torpedo at hundreds of kilometers an hour was to add a special segment to the nose cone of a torpedo filled with pressurized gas. That gas in turn is ejected at extremely high pressures and creates a bubble around the torpedo. A rocket motor, rather than a traditional propeller, then pushes the torpedo along. And since it's avoiding drag from the water, the torpedo could reach incredible speeds. The design was a success, but because of the need to maintain a gas bubble, the range of the torpedo was only a few miles. By scaling the technique up dramatically, the US hopes to cocoon an entire submarine in a gas bubble, and then use the powerful rocket motors to blast across the ocean at speeds faster than sound. The physics involved showed that the concept could work, and already does at smaller torpedo scales. Yet so far, the US has been unable to overcome several obstacles, one of those being the difficulty in maintaining the integrity of a large enough bubble around the submarine and keeping it from pulsating dangerously. During current smaller-scale tests, the bubble tended to expand and contract to such extremes that parts of the submarine model made frequent contact with water. At extreme speeds, that would be disastrous and could rip a submarine apart, or at the very least create so much friction that the submarine would go wildly off course. To overcome the problem, scientists are experimenting with moderating the rate of gas release at the tip of the submarine. China's approach to the problem uses traditional supercavitation techniques, with a new technique that involves spraying a special liquid membrane onto the vessel's hull to reduce its friction with the water. The vessel would gradually speed up with this membrane being constantly sprayed on it as it was worn away. Once hitting about 62 miles per hour, an air bubble could be formed and maintained. China's solution would entail the use of a synthetic lubricant of sorts to help a vessel slip through the water. It also provides a possible fix to one of the biggest practical challenges facing supercavitating vessels. How do you steer it? Moving at such incredible speeds, if you were to extend a fin or control surface into the water, it would be immediately snapped off, and the force exerted might throw your submarine into a spin, which would lead to disaster. Yet by moderating the flow of their liquid membrane, the Chinese could ensure that one side of the submarine's bubble experiences slightly more drag than the other, which would allow a sub to turn, dive, or rise as it sped along at the speed of sound. If it truly works, it would be an elegant solution to one of the biggest practical hurdles facing this entire concept. Yet a supersonic submarine would not make for a very good offensive weapon, as submarines are in fact extremely vulnerable assets whose best defense is stealth. A submarine crossing the ocean at supersonic speeds may be able to get from San Francisco to Shanghai in 100 minutes, but it will generate so much noise that even a deaf sailor would hear it. That would make a supersonic sub extremely easy prey for surface anti-submarine ships or other hostile attack subs. That's why the technology will likely not be used for offensive purposes, but rather for logistical ones. Supersonic subs that could cross the Pacific in just over an hour would be ideal for quickly moving personnel and resources to conflict areas, and would be incredibly appealing for the US, which faces the prospect of coming to the aid of its NATO allies in Europe in case of war against Russia. For decades, Russia has counted on the fact that in the case of war, it might be able to force a ceasefire favorable to its interests by quickly overwhelming European defenders and then digging in before the bulk of US forces could arrive weeks later from America. Faced with the prospect of a difficult war against an entrenched enemy and the massive civilian casualties it would cause, NATO might be more inclined to simply acquiesce to part of Russia's demands rather than wage a very costly war. Yet a supersonic underwater transport vehicle could change all of that by giving the US the ability to move large amounts of personnel and equipment across the Atlantic in a matter of hours. That would make a US buildup possible in days rather than the weeks it would currently take to ship American attack helicopters and armor across the ocean. Such a fast transport system would also give US leaders a capability they have dreamt of for decades: the ability to put boots on the ground nearly anywhere in the world within hours. As one US military officer once noted, the ability to place a company of US infantry anywhere in the world within a few hours would stop a lot of wars before they started. Supersonic submarines could be revolutionary tools for any nation's navy, yet the technical challenges are formidable, and it's unlikely that they'll be overcome anytime soon. Some worry that pilfering of U.S. secrets by China may erode the U.S.'s military edge over its potential adversary, but the continued theft of low-level secrets by Chinese hackers merely points at a culture that is more adept at trying to steal revolutionary new technologies than to invent its own, something that would be of serious concern for Chinese military planners. A sickening groan echoes through the submarine as it descends into the darkness of the ocean. As the vessel goes deeper and deeper, the pressure pushing against its hull becomes greater and greater. At some point, the pressure is too much. The steel and titanium hull collapses, and the entire submarine folds in on itself, consuming anything and anyone inside. There are some inherent risks with diving deep into the murky depths of the ocean in a submarine. You could run out of air, end up poisoned, or be crushed to death. If you find yourself in a sinking submarine moments before it implodes, you're in for a pretty horrible death. The good news is that it'll be over in a matter of milliseconds. The bad news is your body will be nothing but a sack of crushed bones and muscles as it sinks to the bottom of the ocean floor. A sudden pressure change of about 50 psi, or 3 to 4 times Earth's atmospheric pressure, is enough to cause your body some serious harm. This amount of pressure occurs in around 112 feet or 34 meters underwater. For a submarine, it's not very deep, but as you descend deeper into the ocean, the pressure continues to increase to the point where your ribs would crack, your lungs would rupture, and you would die before you even had the chance to drown. To be clear, your body would only be crushed by a sudden change over 50 psi. If you experienced a gradual change in pressure, your body could withstand around 400 psi, or 27 times Earth's atmospheric pressure. In fact, the record for the world's deepest scuba dive is 1,090 feet, or 332 meters. Unfortunately, the pressure change is not a gradual one when a submarine implodes. Before we get into the gruesome details of death by submarine implosion, we need to understand what an implosion actually is, how a submarine keeps it from happening, and what can cause the catastrophic event. An implosion is the exact opposite of an explosion. When something explodes, a large amount of energy is released and moves in an outward direction from where the initial reaction occurred. An implosion, on the other hand, is when a large amount of force moves inward. For example, when air or water pressure is greater outside of a container than inside, such as in the submarine, the difference in pressure results in an inward force all around the container. This is because pressure and forces in the physical world want to be in equilibrium. In order for this to happen, the pressure inside and outside of the submarine needs to be the same. Hence why the much higher water pressure outside of the sub pushes inward, as the water naturally wants to fill the much lower air pressure within the submersible. Just to give you a better idea of how much pressure there is deep in the ocean, let's run through some scenarios. Right now, if you're watching this video at sea level, there is 14.7 pounds per square inch of air pressure pushing against you on all sides. This is also known as 1 atmospheric unit, or ATM. If you're high up in the mountains, the air pressure is slightly less, as there's less atmosphere pushing down on you. If you are in a deep hole, the pressure pushing down on you would be slightly higher than the 14.7 psi, as there's more atmosphere above you than at sea level. Since our bodies and every living thing that lives on land evolved to withstand that amount of pressure, it's not a big deal. This is because the fluids in your body are pushing outward with the same amount of force as the atmospheric pressure is pushing inward. However, as you descend deeper underwater, this pressure increases. This is because you now have the combined weight of the atmosphere and all the water above you pushing down on your body. With each foot or meter you descend underwater, that much more weight pushes down on you. So, what exactly does this mean? If you're under a few feet of water, your body won't register much of a pressure change. This is because there's just not that much additional weight pushing down on you. However, if you descend to a depth of around 33 feet, around 10.06 meters, the amount of water pushing on you is comparable to the pressure the atmosphere exerts on your body. This means that you would now have approximately 29.4 psi of pressure pushing inward on your body, or 2 ATM. This pattern continues every 33 feet or 10 meters as you go. At 100 feet or 30.5 meters, you have just over 3 ATM or 44 psi of pressure pushing against your body. This would be like having 4 1-gallon sized tins of paint pushing on every square inch of your body. The fluids inside of you would still be able to push outward with the same amount of force, but as you descend even further, the pressure will eventually become too great and your bones will begin to break. An Ohio-class nuclear submarine has an operational depth of 984 feet or around 300 meters. However, these vessels can reach 1,640 feet or 500 meters if circumstances call for it. Now let's assume you're on an Ohio-class sub at operational depth. The pressure pushing against the hull at 984 feet is 410 psi, or 30 times the pressure of the atmosphere pushing against you at sea level. If the hull gave under this pressure, 410 pounds or 186 kilograms of water would push inward on every inch of the sub's hull until it imploded. And the 1 atm on the inside of the vessel equalized with the 30 atm on the outside of the vessel. This would happen instantaneously and would crush pretty much anything inside the sub except for dense metals. However, for the adventurous, there are subs that can descend much deeper than the 300 meters below sea level. Recently, the Titan submersible was lost while heading to view the Titanic wreckage at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Several submersibles have made this journey. The first crewed expedition was conducted in 1986 aboard the DSV Alvin. Alvin descended to a depth of approximately 12,500 feet or 3,810 meters. This means that the pressure pushing inward on the vessel was about 5,600 psi or 381 atm. A sudden catastrophic failure resulting in an implosion at this depth would leave very little but mangled pieces of the hull behind. This is what happened to Titan, which we'll look at later on. Interestingly, there are animals that have no problem surviving the crushing pressures deep in the ocean. For example, most whales can dive to extraordinary depths where the pressure would pulverize a human, and even some submersibles. Sperm whales descend over 7,000 feet or 2,134 meters below the ocean surface to hunt for giant squid. This means that their bodies experience over 3,100 psi of pressure, or approximately 213 atm, before surfacing for another breath of air. Whales are able to dive to extreme depths thanks to the flexibility of their bodies. Their ribs are surrounded by loose, flexible cartilage that allows the skeleton to safely collapse and expand as needed. This prevents the whale's bones from snapping. Human skeletons, on the other hand, cannot withstand anywhere near the amount of pressure a whale can. This is one of the reasons why we're limited to diving just a few hundred feet under the water. When the hull of a submarine fails, all of the water pressure that is pushing inward instantaneously equalizes as water fills the space where the hull once had been, destroying anything that can't withstand the massive and instantaneous pressure change, such as a human body. But what does this look like, and how painful would it be to be crushed in a submarine implosion? Before we answer these questions, let's figure out how a submarine works and how it's able to withstand the massive pressure of the depths of the ocean. On a basic level, all submarines use air and water to control their buoyancy and allow the vessel to rise or sink in the water. When a submersible needs to rise to the surface, the sub's ballast tanks fill with air, reducing the vessel's density and making it more buoyant. This allows the submarine to overcome the force of gravity pulling the ship downward. In order to dive deeper, these ballast tanks are purged of air and filled with water. This causes the submarine to become denser and less buoyant, resulting in it sinking. If a submersible's crew wants to remain at a certain depth, the ballast tanks need to be filled with the right proportions of water and air to make the vessel neutrally buoyant. This prevents the sub from rising or sinking. Implosions of submarines have occurred in the past when vessels were damaged and couldn't feed air into the ballast tanks. This resulted in the submarines descending deeper and deeper. Every vessel has its breaking point where the water pressure becomes too great, and the frame starts to bend or collapse. When this happens, the submarine implodes. But there are other major concerns aboard a submarine other than just catastrophic failures. The only reason that a submarine implodes is that the pressure on the inside of the vessel is significantly lower than the pressure on the outside. However, this is also what allows the crew of a submarine to survive while inside the hull. If the inside pressure is equalized with the pressure outside of the submarine as it descended, an implosion wouldn't be possible because there would be no sudden change in pressure. Hence why ships resting deep on the ocean floor aren't just crumpled balls of metal, but still maintain their shape and structure. As a sinking ship descends downward, water floods every compartment, equalizing the pressure inside and outside of the ship. Unfortunately, that kinda defeats the purpose of a submarine. A much lower pressure must be maintained inside the submersible than outside so the crew can breathe and aren't crushed to death. The air we breathe isn't just oxygen, which means that the air inside a submarine is a mix of several gases. An average breath is made up of about 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.94% argon, and 0.04% carbon dioxide. This is more or less the composition of the air aboard a submarine. When we exhale, the air released from our lungs contains around 4.5% carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of the processes that keep us alive, such as cellular respiration. What all this means is that submarines have complex systems to allow the occupants on board to breathe and not be crushed. This also means that an implosion is not the only thing you have to worry about if you're deep underwater in a submersible. Oxygen needs to be constantly replenished so you don't suffocate, and carbon dioxide must be removed so you aren't poisoned. In smaller vessels, the air mixture might be self-contained with a limited supply. Once the supply runs out, that's it. The crew either needs to surface or they'll die. On larger vessels, processes such as electrolysis can be used to separate water molecules into their independent parts of oxygen and hydrogen. The oxygen generated this way can then be circulated through the vessel for the crew to breathe. This means that these types of vessels can stay underwater indefinitely. The only limitation is the amount of food it can hold to feed the crew. To remove carbon dioxide from the air, soda lime, which is made up of sodium hydroxide and calcium hydroxide, is used inside scrubbers. The soda lime traps carbon dioxide and removes it from the air. Problems arise when these systems fail, and the air inside of the sub becomes a mixture of gases that is not safe to breathe. For example, if the carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide levels become too high due to a malfunction in the scrubbers, the entire crew could pass out and eventually die. At that point, the submarine would be left to its own devices, which could ultimately lead to it sinking and imploding. Another threat to submarine crews that could also lead to a catastrophic failure and an implosion is the cold temperatures of the ocean. The surface will almost always be warmer than deep water. Submarines typically travel through waters that are around 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. The heat from within the submarine is lost through the hull into the frigid dark waters around it. This means that electric heaters need to be constantly running to keep the crew alive. However, these cold temperatures can also lead to deadly problems and result in a series of events that lead to an implosion. We'll look at how this happened to at least one submarine later on. The complex systems within a submarine mean that any number of things could go wrong. There are many ways to die deep under the waters of the ocean. Suffocation is one. Freezing to death is another. Both of these would be terrible ways to go. They would take time to kill you while you looked into the blackness of the sea praying for someone to rescue you. An implosion, on the other hand, would occur in milliseconds. You would be crushed to death long before your brain could even register something was wrong. So although death by submarine implosion would be a horrible way to go, it would be somewhat merciful as there would be no suffering. One moment you'd be alive and the next there would be practically nothing left of you. Now let's go examine some of the submarines that have imploded in the past and what happened to their crews. There were no survivors in each one of these tragic events. The reason for this is that if a submarine implodes, there's zero chance anyone could survive. Their bodies would have been instantly annihilated by the pressure change, and anything that did remain would sink to the bottom of the ocean. In 1963, the nuclear-powered Permit-class submarine USS Thresher and its crew suffered a gruesome fate in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. On April 9th, the Thresher began dive trials off the coast of Cape Cod after it had been refurbished and outfitted with new components. At 7:47 a.m., the submarine descended to a test depth of 1,300 feet or 400 meters. The crew began to inspect the ship for leaks or any other malfunctions and found none. Later in the dive, one of the pipe joints on the ship ruptured either due to pressure or faulty installment. This leak occurred in the engine room, and soon after it started, the compartment began to fill with mist. The captain was informed of the leak and would have made the decision to blow the ballast and rise to the surface. The pressurized air in the pipes instantly began to cool and condense, leading to moisture freezing in the pipes and stopping the flow of air to the ballasts. The water leaking from the faulty pipes likely came into contact with wiring and electronics that then caused them to short circuit, leading to an automatic shutdown of the submarine's reactor. As a result, the submarine lost propulsion and could neither steer toward the surface nor fill its ballast tanks with the air necessary to increase buoyancy. The commander likely ordered propulsion to be shifted to the emergency battery-powered backup system. The crew rushed to get the leak contained and then would have begun to restart the reactor to get the main power back online. This process would have taken at least 7 minutes once it was initiated. At around 9:13 a.m., the commander of the vessel used the underwater telephone to transmit a message to a naval craft on the surface that was there to assist if anything went wrong during the trials. The message was garbled, but the words "experiencing minor difficulty, have positive up angle attempting to blow" could be made out. Due to flooding in the engine room, the USS Thresher was becoming heavier. This caused it to descend deeper. A second attempt to purge ballast of water was performed, but the ice in the pipes blocked the pressurized air from reaching the tanks. At 9:17 a.m., a second transmission was sent. Decipherable words in this message were "exceeding tested depth." This meant the Thresher had passed 1,300 feet or 400 meters below sea level. The pressure at that point would have been over 588 psi or 40 atm. 1 minute later, the naval ship on the surface detected a high-energy, low-frequency noise. This was the sound of the USS Thresher imploding, killing all 129 crew members on board instantly. The submarine most likely suffered a catastrophic failure due to the high pressure at a depth of around 2,400 feet or 730 meters, which was around 400 feet or 120 meters below the vessel's maximum depth. The pressure pushing inward on the submarine was 1,073 psi, which was 73 times greater than the pressure on the inside of the vessel. Everyone inside the sub died within a tenth of a second after the submarine imploded. Another sub that imploded was the Argentine naval vessel Ara San Juan. This submersible was a TR-1700 class diesel-electric submarine. On November 16, 2017, the submarine and its 44 crew members went missing in the San Jorge Gulf. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States all sent vessels to aid in the hunt for the missing submarine. After 2 weeks of searching, no sign of the San Juan or its crew had been found. The search turned from a rescue mission into a salvage operation. The following year, the San Juan was located by a remote submersible at a depth of 2,976 feet or 907 meters. The wreckage of the submarine covered an area of 230 feet or 70 meters. When the submarine imploded, its hull was torn apart. All 44 members of the crew died instantly as 1,338 psi or 91 atm of pressure crushed their vessel. This brings us to the modern day and the Titan tragedy, where 5 people lost their lives when the submersible imploded on its way to view the Titanic. Many experts theorize the catastrophic failure that caused the Titan to implode was the result of an experimental hull made up mostly of carbon fibers. Traditional submarine hulls are constructed using steel, titanium, and aluminum, all of which have been extensively tested and researched at extreme depths. This has allowed engineers to understand how the materials will react under extreme pressure. The same cannot be said about the Titan's hull. The materials of the Titan sub likely had a flaw that caused the hull to crack or collapse, resulting in an implosion. The submersible had already completed several deep dives, which may have caused the weakening of the hull, resulting in a catastrophic failure and implosion of the vessel. Like all submarine implosions, the Titan catastrophe was instantaneous. All 5 people on board were instantly crushed, and the remains of the submarine sank to the bottom of the ocean. Its pieces came to rest approximately 1,600 feet or 488 meters from the Titanic. All human constructs are bound to have flaws. Submarines are no different. Suffocating to death or drowning would be a terrible way to go. However, there is something truly terrifying about being alive 1 second and having every bone in your body crushed to dust in milliseconds. This would be a painless death, but it would leave very little for your loved ones to mourn over after you were gone. The date is May 23, 1939, and several hundred feet below the Atlantic waves just off the east coast of the United States. A group of submariners and their captain huddle together in the freezing darkness. Their submarine has gone down, rear compartments flooding and causing the crippled sub to settle on the mud at the bottom of the sea. A rescue buoy with a telephone line was released hours ago, and yet still no contact has been established with the outside world. As far as the men are aware, nobody even knows they've gone under, and every minute that goes by, the air supply dwindles and the odds of rescue grow even slimmer. Suddenly though, in the pitch dark, there's the ringing of the emergency telephone, rigged directly via hard line to the rescue buoy up top. Captain Oliver F. Naquin picks up the receiver, and as he utters a greeting, the line goes dead. Up top, a sea swell has severed the telephone line, leaving the trapped crew cut off from the world and with no idea if rescue will ever come. Between 1921 and 1938, 825 sailors across 18 submarines from various countries all died beneath the waves. The reputation of submarines was so poor that in the US, sailors called it the coffin service. Insurance policies specifically dictated that they would not be paid out if the recipient died in a submarine accident. These underwater tools of war were by far the most dangerous ever created, and yet as World War I had proven, they could turn traditional naval power on its head. During the First World War, Britain operated the world's most formidable navy and kept the German Navy boxed in on their home ports for the vast majority of the war. Yet German submarines routinely slipped past Royal Navy ships to decimate shipping on the Atlantic, to the point that Britain's economy was put in dire jeopardy. Despite their dangers, navies around the world knew that the submarine was a vital tool of underwater warfare, and those that chose to ignore the use of subs did so only at great peril. A state-of-the-art ship at her time, the Squalus was launched on the 14th of September 1938, just 2 months behind her sister ship. She would be officially commissioned on March 1, 1939, and underwent sea trials during the following months. Commanding the state-of-the-art ship was Captain Oliver F. Naquin, who had headed a crew of 5 officers and 51 enlisted men. He was known as a stern commander, exactly the type of man you wanted in control of a ship where the smallest mistake could cost everyone on board their lives. As a diesel-powered submarine, the Squalus would loiter at the surface long enough to charge her great banks of batteries with her diesel engines. However, once the batteries were charged, the ship would dive beneath the waves to avoid detection. One of the most advanced subs in the world, the Squalus could dive up to 250 feet and could travel up to 11,000 miles without refueling. On the morning of the 23rd of May, the Squalus once more put out for routine diving tests, moving 13 miles southeast of Portsmouth. Aboard that day were 2 Navy Yard engineers and a General Motors representative, who were all there to evaluate the Squalus's ability to dive at high speed within 60 seconds, exactly as she would have to do during wartime to avoid enemy planes. On the bridge, the captain orders the dive to begin, and the comms officers radio the sub's location back to Portsmouth as the diving klaxons begin to sound. Moving at 16 knots, the Squalus begins to sink beneath the waves, and in the control room, the alarm board, also known as the Christmas tree, shows green lights across the board, indicating that all hull openings were closed. These openings included not just the main hatch and ballast tanks, but also induction pipes situated behind the conning tower, which fed air into the giant diesel engines and ventilated the boat, getting rid of the diesel exhaust. In order for the dive to be successful, the submarine had to quickly shut down the diesel engines, close the induction pipes, and turn on the battery-powered electric motors. The dive seems to be perfect, and in minutes, the Squalus is already 20 feet below the waves. Suddenly, Captain Naquin notices his ears pop from a fluctuation in air pressure, and simultaneously, a frantic plea comes over the ship's intercom from the engine room. "Take her up! The induction's open!" The Christmas tree shows green lights across the board, yet over the intercom, the chief engineer is screaming for the boat to surface, and the roar of water can be heard in the background. Inside the engine room, seawater is flooding through the induction pipes and quickly filling the compartment as men struggle to hang on and make their way to the main hatch. A sudden rush of air signals the ballast tanks being blown in an attempt to lift the drowning sub, and for a moment it looks as if it'll work. The sub's descent stops and the ship shudders in place, but then begins sinking again. Suddenly the stern plunges backward at a 45-degree angle, sending sailors tumbling backwards into the freezing water. Those that had made it to the engine room's hatch are thrown back and away. On the bridge, Captain Naquin hangs onto the periscope as the sub tilts dramatically backwards. He makes a very hard decision and immediately orders that all hatches be sealed. This will trap men in the flooded compartments, but may be the only way to save the ship. Electrician's mate 3rd Class Lloyd Mannis is at his post between the control room and the flooding rear compartments, trying to shove closed the 200-pound door, but the steep angle is making it almost impossible. Suddenly, he hears shouts from the compartments behind him, men screaming for him to hold the door open, but Mannis grunts with effort and slams the door shut, trapping the men behind it. With water already reaching the control room, it is the only choice to make, even if he has just doomed all the men behind that door to death. In the torpedo room at the tail of the sub, 17 men try in vain to seal themselves in, but the rising seawater makes it impossible for them to seal their hatch. In the engine room, a sailor has reached one of the escape hatches and unlocked it, but the pressure of the ocean outside keeps it sealed shut and gives no chance for escape. Ahead of the sealed door, keeping the rest of the sub from sinking, the forward battery room suddenly experiences a rapid voltage drain. Chief Electrician's mate Lawrence Gaynor realizes that the batteries have been exposed to seawater and an explosion is imminent. As the power flickers off, he takes a flashlight and lowers himself down into the narrow crawl space underneath the main deck, crawling forward in several inches of water toward the giant battery banks. A single stray arc of electricity would instantly fry him, yet the sailor continues on. Reaching the bank of batteries, he disengages one of the 2 large disconnect switches, and suddenly a miniature lightning storm erupts right before his eyes. A cascade of blue-white electricity sizzles and melts the insulation on the hull and half blinds the sailor. Reaching through the arcing electricity to the second switch, he disengages the second switch, cutting the flow of electricity altogether and avoiding an explosion. His actions will ensure that the sailors have a hope of rescue, even if it's cost him part of his vision. The submarine continues its slow descent into the depths of the Atlantic. In the dark, the survivors fear that the ship will implode at any second, and the hull groans and creaks as it takes on the weight of the ocean above it. Rated to a crush depth of 250 feet, the crew doesn't know just how far down this part of the ocean stretches, and while they're still on the continental shelf, they could hit a depth of up to 400 feet. Implosion would kill them all in an instant. Underwater recordings of implosion events confirm that it occurs so quickly, the human brain does not have the time to register it happening. A small mercy for any doomed submariner. Suddenly, though, the crew is thrown to the floor as the sub hits the muddy floor below, settling 240 feet below the Atlantic. The 33 survivors take stock of their situation. They have approximately 48 hours of air and enough mumps and lungs for every survivor. The lungs are breathing devices designed to allow the crew to float to the surface, but they've only been tested to a depth of 200 feet. And even if they worked properly, the crew could die from the bends. Swimming to the surface would be a last desperate result. A rescue buoy has been dispatched, with signaling rockets being fired off automatically at a periodic rate. A telephone line attached to the buoy will allow the crew to speak with any would-be rescuers. In the dark, the men wonder if there are survivors in any of the other compartments. They tap on airlines that lead from one end of the ship to the other, but there's no response. Many hours later, the crew can hear the sound of propellers overhead and spirits soar. Another submarine has discovered their location. A few minutes later, the phone rings, but almost as soon as Captain Naquin replies, an ocean swell snaps the taut telephone cable. The crew settles in once more, comforted at least by the thought that they have been found and the Navy knows they're alive. Almost immediately, the Navy orders the submarine tender Falcon to make haste out of New London, Connecticut. Aboard it is an experimental rescue chamber, in essence a giant diving bell. The inverted tumbler-looking device had only ever been used in training and not in an actual rescue attempt. Its inventors, Lieutenant Commander Charles Momsen and Commander Alan McCann, both accompany the rescue chamber to assist in the recovery operation. Other Navy ships arrive at the Squalus' location and use grappling hooks dragged across the seafloor in an attempt to pinpoint the exact location of the stricken sub. Finally, a heavy anchor manages to snag the wreck, and the sailors both up top and below settle in for the overnight wait for the rescue ship to arrive. In the Squalus, the sailors communicate via Morse code with the ships above, banging out messages with welding hammers against the hull. A casualty count is generated and relayed back to Portsmouth, where family members and reporters are gathered awaiting any news. As reports of the accident speed around the world, global attention turns to the rescue efforts, though none believe they'll be successful. To date, few submarine rescues have ever been attempted, let alone achieved. Throughout the night, Captain Naquin orders his men to engage in labor breathing, or short, sharp inhalations meant to conserve oxygen. This leaves the sailors with severe nausea and headaches, though from time to time the captain releases stored oxygen to help with the symptoms. They might still have to swim for it, and if so, the men would need to be in physical condition to do so. At 0800 hours, the Falcon at last moors over the Squalus, 23 hours after its sinking. An hour later, a hard hat diver begins his descent, carrying a cable connected to a winch on the rescue bell itself. He has to find the forward escape hatch and connect the cable hull to the Squalus, allowing the bell to guide itself in position over the hatch. 5 minutes after leaping overboard, the men inside the sub hear the diver land with a loud thud on the deck over the forward torpedo room. With just a few inches of steel between them, the men can hear every word the diver communicates back to the surface and are elated. Yet the diver has been severely affected by the extreme depth and is battling confusion and slow reflexes as he scrambles to try to find the hatch. A few more minutes and the diver at last succeeds in connecting the cable to the hatch and signals the all clear up top. For an hour, the rescue bell makes its slow, steady descent to the Squalus until at last settling gently around the hatch. A rubber gasket seals the chamber to the hatch and water is pumped out. This is the critical moment in the rescue. If the bell has been poorly designed, the airlock could fail, and as the submarine hatch is opened, the extreme pressure will rip the rescue bell free, killing the survivors and the rescuers both. 3 taps on the hatch signals the all clear from the rescue bell, and with a deep breath, Torpedo Man First Class John Mikowski cranks it open. Water splashes down on him, but the seal holds. 3 trips to the surface have already been made and only 10 survivors remain, including Captain Naquin, who insists on being last. Loading into the rescue bell, the bell breaks free of the Squalus and begins its slow ascent. Suddenly, though, the bell jams on its downward cable, immediately straining another cable which runs from the winch on the Falcon up above down to the bell itself. Under the enormous strain, 5 of the 7 strands that weave together the heavy-duty steel cable snap free, and a diver is immediately dispatched back down to the Squalus to cut the downward cable free. Once the cable is cut though, the crew above decide to let the bell drift back down to the bottom while they decide what to do next, and the bell slowly settles back down on the Atlantic floor. Captain Naquin can't help but chuckle ironically. He's survived a submarine sinking only to possibly die from sinking again on the rescue vehicle. At last though, the sailors up top decide to pump compressed air into the rescue bell in order to lighten it. Then very carefully the bell is lifted up by hand. Dozens of sailors straining with the steel cable, raising the bell inch by inch from the bottom of the seafloor. 4 hours later, the bell is at last at the surface. A Navy court inquiry concluded that a mechanical malfunction doomed the ship, but exonerated the Squalus crew and singled out Captain Naquin for outstanding leadership during the crisis. 26 men in total died that day, but 33 survived, many continuing to serve aboard submarines, where 4 would die in action during World War II.
On January 23, 1960, the Trieste touched down on the sandy soil at the bottom of Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the Mariana Trench and deepest point in the world. At a depth of 35,815 feet, the Trieste withstood an incredible 1.25 metric tons per square centimeter of pressure, although the single plexiglass window had cracked on the way down, giving American Don Walsh and Frenchman Jacques Piccard a good scare. Yet the Trieste was not a submarine, but rather a bathyscaphe specifically designed to withstand the tremendous pressure. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we ask, how deep can submarines go? It's said we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the bottom of our own oceans. And the reason why may have a lot to do with how incredibly difficult it is to visit the deepest depths. As a submarine slips beneath the waves, the weight of the water above it presses down on its hull. The deeper you go, the more water above you and the greater the pressure on your submarine. Bathysphere or bathyscaphs, such as the Trieste, are able to dive to much deeper depths than a submarine because they are spherical as opposed to the cylinder design of a submarine. A sphere is better able to resist pressure because it takes advantage of its arch-like construction, something discovered by the ancient Romans who used arches extensively in their grand architecture. As force presses down on the arched top half of a bathysphere, the pressure is distributed equally across the entire sphere. A cylinder, on the other hand, does take advantage of some of the arch-like characteristics of a bathysphere, but aren't as effective in spreading out the pressure exerted on them as a completely rounded sphere. For utility reasons, submarines also must be designed differently so they can hold crew, equipment, and weapons, while a bathysphere is typically limited to only a few square feet of space. The Trieste, for example, housed her crew in only 7 square feet of living space, making for an incredibly cramped 4.5-hour ride to the bottom of the ocean. Submarines are thus far more limited in their cruising depths than a specially built bathysphere, and each submarine has different depth ratings. Oxygen becomes toxic at higher pressures, and humans can suffer extreme physiological effects from high air pressure. As oxygen becomes pressurized, it forms large amounts of superoxide anion and peroxide, which are highly toxic to living cells. While the human body secretes multiple enzymes to protect itself from these effects, under high pressure, the production of these highly reactive species overwhelms a cell's ability to protect itself, destroying the cell. Prolonged exposure to high-pressure oxygen can lead to dizziness, convulsions, and eventually death. Nitrogen, too, becomes highly toxic to humans at high pressures, inducing nitrogen narcosis or rapture of the deep, which produces a drunken-like state in the victim. Some divers suffering from nitrogen narcosis have died from willingly removing their scuba equipment in their confused state. To protect its crew, a submarine must therefore be able to keep the air inside at a relatively normal pressure, which then creates a massive pressure difference between the inside and outside that its hull must resist. Given operational concerns such as stealthiness and the necessity to effectively engage in combat, submarines are therefore far more limited in their diving ranges than a bathysphere. Typically, each submarine has a design depth which is calculated by engineers who take into account materials available and any new technological developments in manufacturing. From there, the ship's designers calculate how thick the hull must be. A sub's test depth is generally set at 2/3 design depth for US submarines and 4/7 design depth for the British Royal Navy, and is the maximum depth at which a submarine is allowed to operate during peacetime. Operating depth, or never exceed depth, is the maximum depth a submarine is allowed to operate under any conditions, to include battle. Crush depth, or collapse depth, is exactly what it sounds like. the depth at which a submarine's hull is expected to crush. So how deep can a submarine actually go? In response to a revelation via their spying network that the United States could easily track all of its very noisy submarines, the Soviet Union launched the Akula-class submarine in the mid-1980s, an absolute monster of a sub 362 feet long with a beam of 45 feet wide. While the full capabilities of a military submarine are kept secret, it was known that the Akula III's test depth was 1,710 feet with a maximum operating depth of 2,000 feet. In response, the US created the Seawolf class, which, while smaller than the Akula, featured significantly better performance than either its nemesis or the Los Angeles class subs that it was supposed to replace. Featuring a hull 2 inches thick made of steel 20% stronger than that used in the Los Angeles class, a Seawolf's crush depth was estimated to be between 2,400 and 3,000 feet. However, in the mid-2000s, the USS Jimmy Carter was modified to support clandestine operations, adding an extra 100-foot section of hull to support the launching and recovery of unmanned vehicles and up to 50 SEALs. The modifications also featured auxiliary maneuvering water jets for precise maneuvering when tapping undersea cables. Given that undersea cables can run to some pretty extreme depths, the true crush depth of a US Seawolf submarine is likely well over 3,000 feet and will remain highly classified. Civilian submarines, however, have dived to much deeper depths. The Alvin class of submarines were made famous as the original model explored the wreckage of the Titanic in 1986. On a secret mission for the US Navy to find and map the wreckage of 2 lost subs, maritime explorer Robert Ballard was granted last-minute permission to attempt to find the wreck of the doomed passenger ship. After a week of fruitless searching, the Titanic was finally discovered at a depth of 2.37 miles beneath the surface. Diving down in his Alvin submersible and accompanied by a remotely operated vehicle, Ballard took many pictures of the famous wreck, and in the years since, other missions to the ship have been successful, to include a dozen dives by American director James Cameron. Small submersibles far exceed the maximum depths of larger military submarines because they don't have to hold as many crew members and can thus take advantage of stronger spherical designs. While modern submersibles may even be capable of reaching the depths of Challenger Deep, none have tried since the famous expedition of the Trieste bathyscaphe. Yet today, surprisingly enough, it's NASA that is interested in very deep diving submersibles. After the discovery of liquid water on Titan, NASA has begun testing designs for a sub capable of diving in the methane-infused water. Yet unlike on Earth, this submarine will need to withstand extreme cold temperatures of around -290 degrees Fahrenheit and greater pressures than regular seawater. Yet lurking beneath the frigid waters of Titan, NASA thinks might be black smokers, volcanic vents like those that litter the surface of our own ocean and are havens for deep-sea life. Stealthy and absolutely deadly, submarines are a Navy's worst nightmare, and the world has seen some very large submarines. But which is the biggest submarine ever built? Join us as we go back to the end of the Cold War to investigate, in this episode of the Infographic Show, the largest submarine ever built. As part of the nuclear triad, submarines represent one of 3 nuclear deterrent forces for a modern nation, the first 2 being land-based ICBMs and nuclear-capable bombers. Their ability to cruise the world's oceans undetected, and, if nuclear-powered, stay submerged for months, makes them the most survivable element of the nuclear triad, almost completely immune to a preemptive first strike. Thus, it's no surprise that both the Soviet Union and the United States invested heavily into their underwater forces. Getting wind in the early 70s of the United States' plans to build a new fleet of ballistic missile subs, specifically the Ohio class, Soviet military planners began drawing up their own plans for an even more formidable nuclear missile submarine of their own. With the US's advantages in anti-submarine warfare and more advanced submarine technology, the Soviets decided that it would be best to build a sub that could operate relatively close to home, where it could be protected by friendly air and naval power. Thus, plans were laid down to build a sub that could operate under the Arctic Circle, still within range of other Soviet military assets, and break through the ice to deliver its nuclear payload. Yet this presented several challenges, as the sub itself would need to be robust enough to break through thick winter ice, and would need extra ballast in order to float the added mass. Being so far from the continental US, the missiles this sub would carry would also need to be larger than average to accommodate for the extra stages and fuel to reach targets as far south as New Orleans from the frigid North Pole. Thus, the Akula, or Typhoon class, was born. An absolute monster of a submarine, the Akula featured reinforced double hulls that could punch through several feet of solid ice and huge ballast tanks to allow it to raise and lower its heavy bulk through the water. At 564 feet, the Akulas were only 4 feet longer than the American Ohio class, but with a beam of 74 feet versus the Ohio's 42 feet, each Akula was nearly twice as wide as their American counterparts. The massive bulk of the Akula class displaced a whopping 48,000 tons, or almost half of the United States' modern USS Gerald R. Ford supercarrier, the largest warship ever built. Each Akula needed all of that extra space in order to fit the massive R-39s, or as NATO designated them, the Sturgeon ballistic missiles. At a whopping 84 tons, each 53-foot-long missile carried up to 10 independently targetable warheads with a variable yield of 100 to 200 kilotons each. With each Akula-class sub carrying 20 of these missiles, it gave them a warhead count of 200 versus the Ohio-class's 192. In just one volley of 10 missiles, a single Akula submarine could strike at 100 targets, delivering a nuclear blast to each 4 to 6 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Though ultimately the Soviet Union ended up building just 6 Akulas, these submarines alone could have devastated every single major American city with bombs left over. With the Americans building 18 Ohio-class subs of their own, if they had partnered with their Akula rivals for a global strike, these 24 submarines working together could have brought the entirety of the world to nuclear ruin, delivering 4,656 nuclear bombs, or between 400,000 to 900,000 kilotons of explosives. Like most nuclear subs, an Akula could technically stay submerged for decades, needing to refuel only once every 20 years or so. Yet the needs of a human crew make this impossible, thus limited by food supplies. An Akula sub could stay under the waves for up to 120 days. By comparison, their Ohio counterparts, with a smaller larder, have a maximum endurance of 90 days before needing resupply. Depth was another area Soviet subs exceeded their American counterparts in, and while this is still a classified figure, it is well known that Soviet subs on average could dive 100 to 200 meters deeper than American subs. Yet while they may have been able to dive deeper, and the Akula could have stayed out at sea for longer, Soviet subs were notoriously noisy and relatively easy for their American counterparts to identify, with one American sonar tech describing an Akula sub as sounding like 2 metal trash cans being dragged through the water. While it was noisier than its American counterparts, it would certainly have been a far more comfortable ship to serve aboard. On any American sub, space is an absolute premium, and a luxury rarely afforded to the crew. Yet the massive Akulas afforded their crews many luxuries absolutely unheard of in the American Navy, to include arcade games, a small pool, solarium, sauna, gym, and common area complete with various plants to help the crew relieve stress. While American submariners often engage in hot bunking, with one crewman sleeping for 12 hours and then giving his bed to another sailor for the next 12 hours, their Russian counterparts were enjoying hot saunas and refreshing dips in a temperature-regulated pool. Most people would have never heard of the Akula class, however, had it not been for Tom Clancy's first novel, The Hunt for Red October. In the novel, a disillusioned Soviet captain attempted to defect to the United States, bringing with them his modified Akula class sub, the Red October. Yet the fictional Red October was less famous amongst elite Soviet military circles than a real Akula-class sub that nearly created a global nuclear disaster. Only recently unclassified, TK-17, one of the first Akula subs built, was ordered out to sea on September of 1991 with the goal of test firing one of its nuclear ballistic missiles. With the Soviet Union on the brink of collapse, the test firing of the monster nuclear missile was meant to signal to the world that the Soviet Union was still powerful and a force to be reckoned with. Yet what followed would mirror the reality of the USSR's political situation. A test missile with inert warheads was loaded onto the TK-17, and the sub made for Arctic waters with the goal of firing the missile so as to impact on Russia's missile range on the Chukotka Peninsula. On September 27, 1991, the sub moved into launch depth and prepared to fire. Yet, instead of boosting clear of the sub and towards the surface, the missile experienced a catastrophic failure of its first stage rocket motor and exploded in its launch tube. With the silo door blown completely off, the launch compartment began to flood, threatening to sink the submarine. Captain Igor Grishkov reacted immediately, ordering the crew to blow the sub's ballast tanks and thus send the boat speeding to the surface. Once above the waves, however, the crew discovered that the test missile's solid fuel propellant had scattered across the upper surface of the sub's missile farm, threatening to explode the 19 live nuclear missiles just inches underneath the hull. Despite the crippling damage already sustained, and not knowing if he would be able to resurface the submarine, Captain Grishkov ordered his crew to dive in an attempt to starve the fire of oxygen. Luckily for them, his plan succeeded, and the sub, along with her 180 nuclear warheads, returned to port safely. Kept secret for over 2 decades, Captain Grishkov never received a medal or other commendation for his extraordinarily brave actions. His quick thinking and willingness to sacrifice himself and his crew prevented what could have become the worst ecological disaster in human history. Unfortunately, Soviet technical expertise did not always match Soviet ambitions, but as the largest submarine ever built, the Akula was an undersea leviathan, and several of its class remain in service. Its deployment in the early 80s took Western military observers by surprise, as they had not expected the USSR to have the ability to build and launch such an ambitious vessel for another decade. With enough firepower to destroy a small country, each Akula still in service remains a formidable deterrent to anyone who would threaten Russia with their own nuclear weapons.
The U.S. Navy's submarine force is known as the Silent Service. Quiet, deadly, and utterly secretive. They represent everything that makes these weapons of war the most feared by sailors on the high seas. With nations around the world fielding submarines ranging in size from half of that of an aircraft carrier to barely the length of a school bus, these undersea terrors are as versatile as they are deadly. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today, we're taking a look at 50 incredible facts about the history, development, and deployment of submarines. 50. L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Scientology, served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and was briefly made a commander of the small submarine chaser USS PC-815, during which he claimed to have sunk 2 Japanese submarines off the coast of Oregon, though a subsequent investigation concluded there was no evidence of any subs in the area. 1 month later, he was relieved of duty for shelling Mexican territory, and supervisors recommended he be assigned duty on a large vessel where he can be properly supervised. 49. In World War II, public weather reports were heavily censored to prevent enemy submarines lurking below the waves from learning about local conditions. A football game in Chicago was covered in fog so thick that the radio announcer couldn't see the field, but he was commended for never once using the word fog or mentioning the weather. 48. In April 1968, a Soviet strategic ballistic missile submarine, the K-129, sunk in the North Pacific Ocean, prompting a massive search by the Soviets. Clued in that the Soviets were likely missing a sub, the US reviewed recordings from their extensive underwater hydrophone network and located the location of the sub's implosion within days. 47. After weeks of a fruitless Soviet search for their missing submarine, the US dispatched their own submarine, the USS Halibut, to the wreck site during the classified Operation Sand Dollar. Using deep submergence search equipment, the Halibut spent several weeks taking over 20,000 close-up photos of the wreck of K-129. 46. Wanting to recover the Soviet wreck in order to pilfer its secrets, the CIA enlisted the aid of American billionaire and known eccentric Howard Hughes, who acted as a front for the construction and deployment of a specially built ship, which would lower a claw to the seafloor and lift the destroyed sub to the surface. 45. Under the pretense of mining manganese nodules from the ocean floor, the Glomar explorer then set off to the location of the wreck and succeeded in lifting up a portion of the forward hull, recovering 2 nuclear torpedoes, sonar equipment, code books, and the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. 44. The CIA considers the recovery of Soviet submarine K-129 one of its greatest Cold War successes, and the bodies of the 6 Soviet submariners were given a burial at sea with full military honors by American seamen. Video of the burial ceremony was given to the Russian government in 1992 as a diplomatic gesture. 43. The only sinking of a submarine by another submarine while submerged occurred on February 9, 1945. When the Royal Navy submarine HMS Venturer scored a direct hit on the U-boat U-864 off the coast of Norway. 42. In total, 9 nuclear submarines have been sunk around the world, and most remain on the bottom of the ocean floor, with their nuclear weapons and reactors intact. 41. The Soviet nuclear submarine K-429 actually sank twice, once at sea from flooding during a test dive, and then after being raised, sinking 2 years later after flooding while moored. Raised once more, this unlucky sub was finally decommissioned 2 years later, no doubt to the great relief of her crew. 40. Only 2 submarine accidents have ever exceeded 100 onboard deaths: the sinking of the USS Thresher in 1963 and Russia's K-141 Kursk in 2000. 39. The sinking of the USS Thresher was the greatest loss of life from a submarine accident ever. After a pipe joint failed, water burst into the sub and shorted out electrical systems, leading to a loss of power. When the ballast tanks were blown to resurface manually, ice plugged the valves and prevented the sub from rising, causing the Thresher to implode at a depth of about 1,300 to 2,000 feet. 38. Second to the sinking of the Thresher, the sinking of the Russian Navy's Kursk killed 118 sailors. Faulty weldings and poor workmanship led to a leak of one of her practice torpedoes' hydrogen peroxide fuel, which caused an explosion equivalent to 220 to 550 pounds of TNT. After settling at the bottom, a second explosion equivalent to 3 to 7 tons of TNT killed all but 23 of the remaining crew. The 23 survivors later died when their chemical oxygen generator created a flash fire, which consumed the remaining oxygen in the compartment they were sheltering in. 37. In May 2012, a dock worker wanting to get out of work early started a fire aboard the moored USS Miami, which consumed the forward section of the sub. The worker was sentenced to 17 years in prison and fined $400 million, which we're sure he promptly paid off. 36. During the Cold War, Finland developed 2 advanced submarines in cooperation with the Soviet Union. Fearful of advanced submarine technology making its way into Soviet hands, the US secretly threatened Finland with severe economic sanctions if it continued its partnership, which Finland promptly terminated. 35. Sound travels very easily through water, so submarines rely primarily on sonar to locate their prey. Experienced sonar operators are extremely valuable to any navy and have learned to identify different classes of ships by the sound of their engines and propellers. 34. Computers are even better at identifying ships by the sounds they make than humans, though. And the most advanced sonar systems can even identify individual vessels by the unique sounds they make due to their specific construction, variations in materials, and tiny flaws or imperfections in their engines or propellers. 33. In order to not give themselves away, submarines rarely engage their own sonar and instead sit quietly for hours or even days listening to the sound of the ocean around them until an enemy gives themselves away by turning on their own sonar or by the sound of their engines and propellers. 32. When actively looking for an enemy submarine, though, LFA sonar is the loudest man-made noise, reaching over 200 decibels. 31. The British HMS Artful is one of the greatest endurance submarines in the world and can stay underwater for 25 years at a time. Its onboard systems automatically produce oxygen and drinking water from seawater. 30. In case of global nuclear war, one of the ways the British nuclear submarine fleet checks to see if the British government is still functioning is to see whether BBC Radio 4 is still broadcasting or not. 29. During the 1960s, afraid that Soviet subs could sever undersea communications cables, which kept the US in contact with its overseas forces, the US deployed a ring of 480 million tiny copper antennas, the length of a stamp and twice the width of a human hair, into space around the Earth. The antennas would help bounce radio signals around the world and thus ensure communications, but were ultimately made obsolete by the creation of the telecommunications satellite. 28. Each British nuclear ballistic submarine contains a sealed and unopened letter of last resort from the current Prime Minister, housed in a nested safe. The letters are handwritten instructions from the Prime Minister, which the captain of each sub is instructed to open only if the British government has been wiped out. The letters are destroyed after each new Prime Minister takes office and replaced with a new one. Only the British PM knows the content of the letters, but it's thought that they include commands for the captain to A. Retaliate with nuclear weapons, B. Not to retaliate, C. Use his or her own judgment, or D. Place the submarine under command of the US or Australia. 27. Submarines are the stealthiest ships in the sea, so stealthy in fact that in 2009, 2 British and French nuclear submarines collided with one another because they couldn't detect each other. 26. After the end of World War I, a German submarine washed up onto a beach in Hastings, England. 25. On February 23, 1942, the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced near Santa Barbara, California, and attempted to shell an aviation fuel facility with its deck gun. Doing little to no damage, the shelling helped prompt the internment of Japanese Americans for fear of enemy collaborators. 24. In 1998, a North Korean midget sub and her crew were lost when they became entangled in a South Korean fishing net. When fishermen notified the South Korean authorities, a South Korean ship secured the stranded submarine and began to tow it to port, only for the ship to be scuttled by the crewmen sealed inside, who then committed suicide. 23. Half of the United States' entire nuclear arsenal is stored aboard 14 ballistic missile submarines. 22. The third leg of the nuclear triad. After ICBMs and nuclear-capable bombers, submarines are the third element of modern nuclear deterrence. Because of their stealthiness and the ability to hide close to enemy shores, submarine-launched nuclear missiles are the most survivable element of the nuclear triad. 21. Each of the U.S.'s 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines carries up to 20 nuclear missiles tipped with 8 100-kiloton nuclear warheads. 20. An Ohio-class Trident nuclear attack missile can independently target each of its 8 warheads, striking 8 targets per missile. Altogether, a single Ohio-class submarine can destroy 160 cities or military bases. 19. The maximum operating length for an Ohio-class submarine is classified and officially annotated as limited only by onboard food supplies. 18. The largest submarine ever built was the Soviet Union's Akula-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine, with a length of 372 feet, a beam of 45 feet, and weighing up to 13,800 tons. 17. The Akula class is one of the only submarines ever built with surface-to-air missiles as part of its weapons package. 16. The Indian Navy currently leases one Russian Akula-2 submarine, the Nerpa, under a lease program with an option to buy at the end of the lease. 15. In August 2009, 2 Akula-class submarines operated off the east coast of the United States, marking the first known Russian submarine deployment to the Western Atlantic since the end of the Cold War. 14. In August 2012, it was discovered that a Russian Akula-class submarine had operated in the Gulf of Mexico undetected for over a month, sparking controversy within American military and political circles. 13. One American or Russian nuclear ballistic missile submarine has enough firepower on board to make it the 6th most powerful nuclear power in the world. 12. Unlike their ballistic missile cousins, attack submarines are known as hunter-killer submarines and specialize in anti-submarine warfare and targeting surface ships. Some even have cruise missile capabilities to strike land targets. 11. The first nuclear-powered submarine was the USS Nautilus, deployed in 1955. 3 years later, the Soviets followed suit with their Project 627 Kit-class submarine. 10. On October 1981, a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine ran aground on the south coast of Sweden, prompting an incident known as Whiskey on the Rocks. 9. Near the end of World War II, a German sailor's inability to properly use the toilet led to the sinking of submarine U-1206 and the capture of her crew. 8. On Friday the 3rd, 1986, Soviet submarine K-219 suffered a catastrophic explosion in one of its missile tubes. As the captain struggled to save the ship, the nuclear reactor, which should have automatically shut down, failed to do so. 20-year-old Sergei Preminin volunteered to enter the reactor room and shut down the reactor manually, which he did. However, water pressure difference between his sealed compartment and the rest of the ship prevented the crew from opening the door, and Preminin asphyxiated inside the sealed compartment. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star for his bravery. 7. After the sinking of K-219, a Soviet research ship located the wreck and discovered that its entire complement of nuclear weapons was missing. To this day, their location is unknown. 6. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, American ships located a Soviet submarine near the coast of Cuba and dropped signaling depth charges meant to force the submarine to surface, running too deep for radio communication and thinking that war may have already broken out above them. The 3 senior officers aboard voted to authorize launch of the sub's nuclear weapons in accordance with operating instructions. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, was the single vote that prevented the unanimous decision required, and thus saved the entire world from nuclear Armageddon. 5. On January 25, 1995, a team of US and Norwegian scientists launched a 4-stage sounding rocket off the northwestern coast of Norway, inadvertently following an air corridor which American ICBMs would use en route to Moscow. The rocket appeared on radar as a US Navy submarine-launched Trident missile. Fearing a high-altitude nuclear attack meant to cripple Russian radar in preparation for a full nuclear strike, Russia's nuclear forces went on full alert, and the Russian nuclear football was brought to the Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who had to decide whether or not to immediately launch a retaliatory nuclear strike against the United States. Thankfully for us, he did not. 4. Per U.S. Navy tradition, no U.S. submarine is ever considered lost if it fails to return. It and its crew are still considered to be on patrol. 3. During World War II, 2 New Zealand trawlers came across a Japanese submarine that outweighed them by 1,000 tons. Refusing to back down, the 2 fishing vessels repeatedly rammed the much larger submarine until they beached it, allowing the U.S. to capture it and vital Japanese codebooks. 2. The U.S. Navy operates a secretive submarine base in a remote lake in northern Idaho, where it develops stealth submarine technology far from prying eyes. It's believed that an underground waterway to the ocean allows it to secretly deploy submarines straight to the Pacific. 1. British submarines fly the Jolly Rogers to honor submarine tradition. With 72 submarines in service, the United States fields the largest underwater fighting force in the world. Stealthy and absolutely deadly against surface vessels, submarines are tasked with deterring foreign aggression, nuclear deterrence, intelligence gathering, and even providing fire support for land forces with land attack missiles. But for the most of a submarine's lifespan, it will glide through the oceans of the world completely undetected, and as they say, out of sight, out of mind. What is life like under the sea for those who man these secretive weapons of war, though? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at what life is like aboard a submarine. Just a quick note about a sponsor of this video, Skillshare. You're about to learn how sailors spend 90 days or more at a time out at sea. But if that was you and you had Skillshare, you could spend that time learning brand new skills or honing existing ones. Skillshare is an online learning community with over 20,000 classes in photography, video production, management, and more, all available online right now. The first 1,000 people to sign up by visiting the link in the description will receive 2 months of Skillshare absolutely free. Join Skillshare and start learning today. Now, let's get back to the video. Not every man can be a submariner, and though it is a 100% all-volunteer force, the U.S. Navy submarine fleet has very stringent entry requirements. Individuals must be male, pass a series of academic tests, psychological evaluations, and intensive courses on the fundamentals of submarine operations. With deployments that can last for hundreds of days at a time, and disaster being only one mistake away, the Navy must be confident that it is entrusting some of the most expensive weapons in its arsenal, and the 100+ lives within them, to only the most psychologically stable and academically qualified individuals. But it isn't a life for everyone who applies. Technically, the US deploys submarines for about 90 days at a time, but the realities of a dynamic geopolitical environment sometimes means that submariners will be out at sea for 100 days or more, pulling into port only long enough to stock up on food reserves before putting out to sea again. One submariner interviewed by Task and Purpose said that his longest deployment was for 328 days. That's a long time spent inside a cramped metal tube underwater. As the U.S. Navy only operates nuclear-powered submarines, each sub's endurance is based on the amount of food it can carry. The reactors will typically only be fueled once during the lifetime of a boat, and a need to keep its crew fed is the only thing that limits how long a submarine can stay out to sea for. Both air and water are regenerated internally, so even long after food runs out, a submarine will still provide fresh drinking water and breathable air. The submarine's crew is split up into 3 6-hour shifts each. Typically, a crew member will have 6 hours on duty, 6 hours of study, exercise, and private time, and 6 hours of sleeping time. This 18-hour day rotation can be disorienting for a crew who spends weeks at a time under the water, and typically crew members only know what time of day it actually is based off of what meal they're being served. Space is at an absolute premium on any submarine, so personal space is extremely limited. Every submariner has typically about 15 square feet to themselves and sleep in tiny bunks, affectionately or not called coffins. Inside your bunk, only a thin sheet of cloth separates you from the outside world, so privacy is nearly non-existent. And because somebody is always sleeping no matter the time of day, submariners have an unwritten rule to never slam doors and always keep volume down to a minimum. Some submariners, however, have more crew than bunk space, which leads to the much-hated practice of hot bunking, where 2 or more submariners share one bunk. As one prepares to start their shift, the other takes his place to get his 6 hours of sleep. Submarines, it seems, are definitely not places for anybody with privacy or personal space issues. Bunks aren't the only place with limited space. There's typically only 2 showers for the entire crew of up to 130 submariners, and a maximum showering time of 3 to 5 minutes is enforced. This not only helps ensure everyone who needs one can get a shower, but it also lessens the strain on the ship's water filtration system, which turns salty seawater into fresh water. There's also typically only a single dryer and washer aboard a submarine, making clean laundry a luxury. For entertainment, there is a tiny gym with typically 1 to 2 machines and free weights which the crew can use. Because space is at such a premium, rooms typically have double uses, and the gym may in fact be the torpedo room. The officer's wardroom, where senior officers dine, also serves as an operating theater during medical emergencies. Bathrooms are extremely limited as well, with typically only 1 bathroom per 40 men. And you'd better know how to use the toilet, because waste has to be held in a special tank to be ejected at the appropriate time. The toilet has to be pressurized before you flush it, but operated improperly and it will shoot its contents backwards into your face. A rec room typically offers a plasma TV or 2 and a large selection of movies to keep the crew entertained. Video game systems are common, along with a small library of games, though the Navy makes cards and board games freely available to help sailors blow off steam and build camaraderie. The most space aboard a submarine is reserved for the nuclear reactor and the propulsion system, which alone take up about 1/3 of the sub's total length. The kitchen takes up the second most amount of space and is typically extremely well stocked. The US Navy knowing for decades that a well-fed crew is a happy crew. Life beneath the waves for weeks or even months at a time can be extremely stressful, and so the Navy makes sure its galleys are well stocked. Sailors can enjoy fresh ingredients for the first few weeks of deployment, though after that food is made from non-perishables. Even then though, chefs manage to whip up a variety of dishes from lasagna to lobster to prime rib, and a delicious dessert is always on hand. There is no internet aboard a submarine, and communication with the outside world is reserved for the rare instances that a sub surfaces. Because initiating communications can give away a sub's position, and stealth is the most valuable asset, submariners don't communicate much with the outside world. That means that submariners can go weeks or months without contacting family or loved ones, and must rely on the friendships they've developed on board. To make the cramped environment more tolerable for each other, submariners have additional unwritten rules, such as no talk of politics on board, although sports trash talk is acceptable if not encouraged. While all of the military branches are keen on traditions and rites of passage, none are as dedicated to their traditions or have as nuanced rites of passage as the Navy. Partly tradition and partly to help keep morale up, submariners enjoy a tradition of initiating new crew members on their first crossing of the equator, called crossing the line. Everyone who has already crossed the line is known as a shellback, and those who haven't are known as wogs, shorthand for polywogs. The polywogs must polish a set of red trash weights used to compact trash and then wear them around their necks for a week before the crossing. Wogs are also given an M&M, which they must keep and defend as their pearl, ensuring that it stays on their person at all times. Upon crossing the equator, the shellbacks spray the wogs with water hoses and dunk them in cold water, which may or may not have been urinated in. Seamen are a strange sort. Then they are escorted to the wardroom, where the fattest submariner on board has been dressed in a baby's diaper and covered in whipped cream, vinegar, mayonnaise, pretty much every condiment available. And then the wog must place their pearl inside his belly button and retrieve it back with their mouth. From that day on, the wog is no more and is welcomed as a full-blown shellback. Strange rituals aside, strong camaraderie is what sets submariners apart from other sailors in the US Navy. And when you're spending weeks at a time in a pressurized cylinder straining to hold back the weight of the ocean, it's understandable that you might need to let some steam off in some pretty creative ways. Because of the high stress of their jobs, submariners are often excused somewhat from the Navy's typical strict regulations on hair and facial hair, allowing short beards and longer than than usual hair for the notoriously tightly clipped U.S. Armed Forces. Once rejoining the rest of the Navy by pulling into port, however, submariners must get the trimmers out and make sure they're back in regs. Life aboard a submarine is tough, a unique mental and physical challenge that not every sailor is cut out for, yet has been argued repeatedly by defense analysts across the U.S. The U.S. Navy's silent service is the most critical element of its national security, from maintaining nuclear deterrence to ensuring the good behavior of not-so-friendly nations by threatening swift and overwhelming retaliation. Submariners are the world's ultimate, if secretive, peacekeepers. How would you like to spend months living in a cramped metal tube hundreds of meters below the surface of the sea, surrounded by nothing but darkness? Would you still volunteer for this job knowing that all that separated you from instant death was a few inches of steel? Or that if that steel were to fail, you would actually be incinerated by the water compressing all the air and igniting the oxygen like a piston before being crushed and turned into a jelly? Or even worse, you could survive in a watertight compartment only to drop to the bottom of the ocean with a dull thump as you sit in cold, wet darkness for days, waiting for the oxygen to run out. Because when things go wrong on a submarine, even the best-case scenario is almost always a death sentence. This show is not for the faint of heart. These are the worst submarine disasters in history. Russian submarine Nerpa, 2008. Imagine hearing the sudden clanging of waterproof doors shutting behind you and in front of you, followed by the sudden roar of a strange gas entering the chamber you've been locked into. It displaces all the oxygen, eventually driving it from your lungs as well. You're asphyxiating in full atmosphere, desperately clawing at the window where the rest of the crew watches you slowly choke to death, unable to help you. Now imagine that all this is happening because some idiot was messing around with equipment he wasn't even meant to have access to. This was the fate of 20 people aboard the Russian submarine Nerpa, an Akula-class submarine. The Nerpa was undergoing sea trials before formally joining the Russian Navy. On the 8th of November, she was deep beneath the waves of the Russian Pacific Fleet's test range in Peter the Great Gulf, an inlet of the Sea of Japan. On board the submarine were 208 people, an oversized complement made up of 81 actual military personnel and 127 engineers from the shipyards which had built and fitted the sub. This is not an uncommon practice in world navies, as it allows for engineers to be on board as systems undergo troubleshooting, and it's a hell of a motivator to make sure you do your job right, because there's little chance to rescue you if you messed up designing or building the submarine. At around 8 p.m., the Nerpa underwent its first dive, and a half hour later, disaster struck. All was going well when suddenly 2 forward compartments were sealed by automatically locking doors. The watertight doors are meant to seal in case of emergency and cannot be easily overridden. Approximately 60 people were cut off from the rest of the submarine. Inside the sealed compartments, confusion reigned, until suddenly the crew noticed that the automatic firefighting system had engaged. Now, dibromo tetrafluoroethane began to flood the compartment, displacing all of the oxygen. This gas is specifically engineered to suppress fires and then interfere with the chemical process of combustion itself. However, in high concentrations, it can cause narcosis, leading straight to death via asphyxiation, plus inflicting injury via frostbite due to its extreme chilling effect. The trapped crew began to beat fervently on the door, but it would be 30 minutes before the fire suppression system was disabled and the room ventilated, and only then were the men actually rescued. The destroyer Admiral Tributz and the submarine rescue vessel Seani were dispatched immediately to provide assistance, but the submarine was able to return under its own power back to port. 41 people were injured by the asphyxiation or the frostbite effect of the gas on their lungs. Another 20 would die. 2 official causes were investigated by the Russians. The Nerpa's fire suppression system was state-of-the-art for the time. While older model systems relied on manual activation, the Nerpa's new system could be set to automatic mode. This allowed the submarine to monitor itself for any fires and immediately move to extinguish them. With fire being the worst nightmare for any submariner, the value of such a high-tech automatic system could not be understated. In order to avoid suffocating, the crew were extensively drilled on how to properly respond to the activation of the firefighting system, which was preceded by klaxons and warning lights. Men in the affected compartments were to immediately don oxygen masks in order to survive the half hour it would take to ventilate the compartment. This is one big reason why so many were seriously injured or died. Most of those in the affected compartments were civilian engineers who had not received such training. While the Nerpa's firefighting system was state-of-the-art, it was also Russian, which left it prone to multiple malfunctions during its installation on the sub. According to the testimony from one of the engineers who helped build the sub, The firefighting system had malfunctioned before, and the 2008 tragedy could have been another such malfunction. However, a second, even dumber explanation does exist. 5 days after the accident, naval investigators announced that crewman Dmitry Grobov had been responsible, turning on the system, quote, without permission or any particular grounds. In plain speak, this means that Grobov was messing around, as bored sailors are known to do, though typically in professional navies they don't murder or injure dozens of people as a result. According to military reports, Grobov started playing with the fire suppression system out of boredom, believing that it had been disconnected. Local control units are protected by 5-digit access codes, but during sea trials, the access codes were stenciled directly onto the units. Grobov accessed the panel, increased the readings coming from the affected compartments from 30 degrees calcium, or whatever Europeans measure with, to 78 degrees chocobo. The system asked for permission to do its job, and Grobov granted it, no doubt thinking this was the most cutting-edge video technology in all of Russia. Colleagues were skeptical of the military report, though, describing Grobov as a skilled and experienced specialist. To be honest, since the Russian military's performance in the Ukraine war, we've learned that this in no way excluded the possibility of Grobov stupidly murdering 24 people out of inept boredom. Others doubted that Grobov could have done this alone because the system required multiple levels of confirmation before being activated, and all that means is that multiple Russian sailors were equally inept. We're really trying hard not to be biased here, but this is the same Navy that's currently losing a war against a nation with no Navy. Because this is Russia, Mikhail Barabanov, editor-in-chief of Moscow Defense Brief, said that accidental discharges of fire suppression systems aboard Russian submarines weren't unheard of, though they don't usually result in fatalities since the crew is trained on how to react. For new Russian submariners, it must be a real morale boost to know that they receive constant training to know how to react in case of a disastrous fire, or if the submarine randomly decides to try to kill you because, oh, by the way, it will absolutely try to do that. ARA San Juan, Argentina, 2017. The San Juan was a diesel-electric submarine in service with the Argentinian Navy since 1985. Just a few years prior to its disappearance, though, it had undergone midlife maintenance, upgrading its engine and batteries. A small diesel-electric attack sub, it was a stealthy boat that in 1994 managed to evade U.S. anti-submarine forces during an exercise and sunk the U.S. command ship USS Mount Whitney. On November 17, 2017, though, tragedy struck, and the reason why still remains a mystery. The day before it went missing, the sub had sent a report that the snorkel had leaked water into the forward storage batteries, causing a small fire. The fire, however, was extinguished successfully, and the batteries disconnected to prevent further problems. The submarine then continued on its mission using power from its aft batteries. For 2 days, the submarine failed to report in, at which point a search was immediately launched. The last known location was recorded on the 15th of November when the boat was 430 kilometers, or 270 moon landing miles, off the coast of Argentina in the San Jorge Gulf and on its way to Mar del Plata. The boat had just concluded an exercise with the Argentinian Navy and was heading to deeper waters. The search was undertaken with the assistance of the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office, which had been established by 40 countries in 2003 as a result of the Kursk disaster, with a search area of 482,507 kilometers, 186,297 proper square miles, and alternating weather conditions. It was like finding a needle in a very turbulent haystack. With no success and only 7 days of oxygen on board, hope was dwindling. Argentina requested the use of hydrophones operated by the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization for help in its search. This global network of hydrophones had been installed to prevent nations from cheating on the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by blowing up nukes underwater. Searching the CTBO's records, an anomaly consistent with the sound of a submarine implosion was confirmed on November 23rd. The event also matched closely with the loss of communication with the sub. The search continued, in hopes of at least finding the wreckage, possibly even survivors in a watertight compartment. Though all knew hope was slim. By November 24th, the search involved 13 countries, including the United States, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and even the former Falklands War rival, the United Kingdom. Searching an area the size of Spain, though, Argentina was forced to concede on November 30th, 15 days after the San Juan went missing, that rescue efforts were over. There was now only the search for wreckage. A year later, the remains of the crushed submarine was discovered at a depth of 907 meters, just 12 kilometers or 12 miles from the location of the implosion sound. All 44 crewmen were lost, including Argentina's first female submarine officer. KRI Nanggala, Indonesia, 2021. Originally purchased in 1977, the nearly 50-year-old submarine had undergone 2 major refits in its life. The latest in 2012 was undertaken in a South Korean shipyard and modernized many of the sub's Cold War systems. In a possible forewarning of disaster to come, though, 3 crew members were killed just months after the South Korean refit when a torpedo failed to launch during an exercise. The Nanggala was damaged enough that it needed to be sent back for repairs. On April 21, 2021, the Nanggala was undergoing torpedo drills. At 3 a.m., the captain asked for permission to dive in order to fire a live torpedo. By 4 a.m., the sub was flooding its torpedo tubes, and at 4:25, the Indonesian Navy received its last communication as the commanding officer of the training task force sent his authorization to go ahead with the firing. The Nanggala fired a live torpedo and then a training torpedo and went silent. By 9:37 a.m., the Navy sent a distress call to the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office, declaring the submarine missing and likely sunk. It was believed that the submarine could have experienced a power outage, causing it to plummet to a depth of around 600 to 700 meters. This was really bad news, as the sub only had a crush depth of 500 meters. A previous power outage had nearly caused disaster, with the boat being saved by the emergency blowing of the forward ballast tanks. While submarines typically have a greater crush depth than publicly recorded, the Bali Sea is known for its underwater canyons, which can reach depths of over 1,500 meters. If the Nanggala had fallen into one of those canyons, its fate was sealed. However, if the submarine had lost power and had come to rest above its crush depth, the crew had approximately 3 days of oxygen to survive on. But others expressed doubt. The submarine was supposed to carry only 38 people, but had been loaded with 53 when it was lost. That would cut their oxygen almost in half. A crisis center with a mobile hyperbaric chamber was established at 2nd Fleet Command HQ in Surabaya, and soon multiple nations had joined in the search effort. The United States sent in multiple Poseidon aircraft which specialized in hunting down submarines. Singapore deployed submarine rescue vessels, and the Royal Malaysian Navy sent the MV Megabakti submarine rescue ship. The Indian Navy made available its deep submergence rescue vehicle, which departed from Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh, and would be at the search site within days. Indonesian divers began searching for the sub in shallower waters, while warships, other submarines, and multiple aircraft began to look around the last known location of the Nanggala. On April 22nd at 7 a.m., traces of an oil spill, possibly fuel and lubricating oils from the submarine, were discovered near where the boat had been observed diving. Hydrophones in the area confirmed that whatever had happened, there had not been an implosion, keeping hopes alive. A false detection of a magnetic object by an Indonesian cruiser raised hopes, but the sub was not located. On the 24th, the Indonesian Navy announced the discovery of debris, including a part associated with torpedo tubes, a coolant pipe insulator, a bottle of periscope grease, and prayer rugs, all within 10 miles of the last point of contact. The Nanggala was declared sunk, and later a sonar scan discovered the submarine at a depth of 850 meters, 350 meters past its official crush depth. An ROV with a max depth of 1,000 meters was launched by the Singaporean ship MV Swift Rescue, which made visual contact with the remains of the submarine on the bottom. The submarine had split into 3 parts, and it was not believed to have imploded given no recorded implosion sounds on nearby hydrophones. A power outage was suspected, as previously a blown electrical fuse forced the emergency blowing of the main ballast tank, so the sub could surface. There were also suspicions of the work done by the South Korean firm which undertook the boat's refit in 2012, given the failed torpedo firing test later that year that killed 3. However, others pointed at the submarine being 15 people over its max capacity of 38 personnel. Later, it was revealed that the commander of the Nanggala, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Octavian, had voiced frustrations over the poor maintenance that the sub had received to a reporter who published an article with his complaints. Octavian complained of poor quality work as well as frequent delays by state-owned shipyard PTPAL Indonesia. Another officer had been disciplined by his superiors after voicing his own complaints about poor workmanship from the state-owned shipyard, which had assembled the Changbogo-class KRI Alugorak, another submarine of which Lieutenant Colonel Octavian commented, "This submarine by PTPAL, there's nothing good about it." The Nanggala was also apparently nearly 12 years behind schedule on major maintenance, despite subs needing to go in for major refits every 6 years. Number 361, China, 2003. It's one of the most tragic submarine disasters in history, and it left the submarine itself completely untouched. Despite the staggering loss of life, if you had to die in a submarine accident, this is probably about as gentle as it's going to happen. Number 361 was an aging boat by the time of her accident, and this likely led to her disaster. A Ming III class submarine, she was a clone of the old Soviet Romeo class, built between the 1950s and early 60s. A diesel-electric boat, she was meant for coastal defense missions and incapable of true blue water operations. In the early 2000s, China was beginning to assert itself against the US in the South Pacific, laying down the foundations of what it would ultimately call anti-access area denial. China undertook a massive ramp-up in training and exercises with its submarine forces. Its subs may have been vastly outclassed by modern US boats, but even an old submarine can present a significant threat in the right circumstance. On April 16, 2003, the number 361 was partaking in naval exercises east of the inner Changshan Islands in the Yellow Sea, just off the coast of northeastern China. The crew included a full complement along with 13 trainee cadets from the Chinese Naval Academy. The exercise was simulating real wartime conditions, and thus the submarine was out of contact for days or even weeks at a time. The Chinese military, however, did not have a strong history of realistic training, something it continues to struggle with. And this, coupled with the age of the boat and possible toll of corruption within the Chinese military, could have all contributed to what happened next. At some point in time while submerged, the submarine's diesel engine failed to shut down properly. It's believed that exhaust would have quickly overwhelmed the submarine, poisoning the crew. The ongoing running of the engine would have also used up all available oxygen, dooming anyone who survived poisoning from the exhaust. It's not exactly clear how any of this happened or why the submarine didn't immediately surface and evacuate its crew. It's important to remember that the Chinese military in the early 2000s was not particularly well known for its competency, and corruption was rampant, two legacies that continue to haunt the Chinese to this day. With senior officers on board who may not have been the best qualified for their position, it's possible that bad command helped fuel an unfolding crisis. China's remained extremely tight-lipped about the incident even in the 2 decades since, and it's rumored that the crew was all discovered dead at their posts, meaning asphyxiation happened relatively quickly. How this could have happened without some safety system alerting the crew shows just how bad shape the People's Liberation Army Navy was in at the time. Kursk disaster, Russia, 2000. Stunning breaches of discipline, shoddy, obsolete, and poorly maintained equipment, negligence, incompetence, and mismanagement. So reads excerpts from the official Russian investigation into one of the worst submarine disasters in history, excerpts that shocked the world at the time, but wouldn't really surprise anyone observing Russia's current performance in Ukraine. The Kursk was designed with one role in mind: to take on and defeat an entire American carrier strike group all on its own. It was one of the biggest cruise missile submarines ever built, second only to America's Ohio class, after a number of the class were converted to carry cruise missiles. Its Type 65 torpedo carried a 450-kilogram warhead, which could conceivably destroy or at least mission kill a carrier with just one hit. She was the pinnacle of Soviet submarine design, and a deadly threat even into the start of the new millennium. But she was also in service with the worst navy in the world. The Kursk had only undertaken a single deployment in her entire 5-year career, spending 6 months monitoring the U.S. 6th Fleet as it responded to the war in Kosovo. With a collapsing post-Soviet economy, there was simply no room in the budget to buy fuel for her nuclear reactors, and some sailors in the Northern Fleet had even gone without pay. Needless to say, training, discipline, and basic standards were catastrophically low, and a lack of deployments meant her crew had little to no experience. All of these factors started to add up, and on her last deployment, accompanied by 118 Russian sailors, tragedy struck the Soviet sub. On August 12, 2000, the Kursk was participating in the first major naval exercise for the Russian fleet in 10 years, and the first since the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia was looking to remind the world that it was still a formidable superpower. The Kursk took center stage, the pride and joy of the Northern Fleet, with her crew having recently won a citation for excellent performance and recognized as the best submarine crew in the entire fleet. The bar must have been pretty low given the report that would follow the accident. Unlike other submarines, the Kursk was one of the few authorized to carry a full combat load at all times, including torpedoes, anti-submarine missiles, and the fearsome Granite anti-ship missile. She also enjoyed the title of being unsinkable, with sailors claiming she could even withstand a direct hit from a torpedo, which really goes to show the quality of Russian sailors at the time. Baffling boasts aside, she was a state-of-the-art vessel for the Russian Navy, and a luxurious craft at that, with both the officers and enlisted enjoying the use of gymnasiums and even a spa inside a hull, as long as 2 jumbo jets. At 8:51 in the morning, the Kursk requested permission to conduct a torpedo training launch using dummy torpedoes launched at the battlecruiser Peter Velikia. She received approval and at 11:29 a.m. loaded the first practice torpedo into number 4 torpedo tube on the starboard side. 34 seconds later, the Norwegian seismic array and other seismic detectors around the world recorded a seismic event of a 1.5 magnitude on the Richter scale. The location was in the Barents Sea off the northern coast of Russia and near Norway, squarely on top of the Kursk's last known position. 2 minutes and 14 seconds after the first event, a second event with the power of a small earthquake measured in at 4.2 on the Richter scale and was registered on seismographs all across northern Europe. The event was detected as far away as Alaska, registered as an explosion with the equivalent power to 2 to 3 tons of TNT. The second explosion was logged as taking place at the same depth as the seabed, leaving little doubt as to what had occurred. The crew of the submarine Karelia had detected the 2 explosions, but the captain believed it was simply part of the ongoing exercise. The Peter Velikia, target of the Kursk's dummy torpedo attack, recorded the hydroacoustic signal of an underwater explosion and felt their own ship shudder from the immense force. They radioed the event back to fleet headquarters, but were naturally completely ignored because explosions massive enough to shake battle cruisers are apparently common in Russia. At 1:30 p.m., the Kursk was expected to complete its fake attack run, but there was still no news from the submarine. With communications equipment along with everything else in a general state of disrepair, comm blackouts were not unexpected, and thus nobody was initially alarmed, though the Peter Velikia did dispatch a helicopter to look for the sub. When the helicopter failed to find signs of the submarine, the Northern Fleet finally began to take the situation seriously. With a missing submarine and reports of 2 explosions in the training grounds, concern led to the alerting of the fleet's head of search and rescue forces. The primary rescue ship was a converted 20-year-old former lumber carrier equipped with 2 deep submergence rescue vehicles, a diving bell, lifting cranes, and other specialized gear. What it lacked, however, were stabilizers to keep the vessel in the right position in the rough seas, and thus it was only capable of carrying out rescue operations in calm waters. Due to budget woes, 2 India-class submarines equipped with deep submergence rescue vehicles were permanently held up in shipyards, awaiting repairs for the last 6 years. Search and rescue efforts, however, did not proceed until 6:30 p.m. after the Ilyushin IL-38 aircraft had failed to spot the submarine, and the Kursk was now overdue for a scheduled communications check. At 10:30 p.m., the Northern Fleet declared an emergency as additional aircraft and ships failed to locate the Kursk anywhere on the surface, and the exercise was stopped. At midnight, the sole operational rescue vessel in the fleet finally left port. Vladimir Putin, who had recently been elected to help destroy Russia, was not informed of the Kursk's disappearance until 7 a.m. the next day. The entire time, the Russian Navy continued to downplay the seriousness of the incident, but word was starting to spread across Russia and the international community both. Later that Sunday, the Northern Fleet commander continued to downplay the incident, holding a press briefing to announce the results of the now cancelled exercise, stating the entire operation had been a resounding success. However, at Vidyevo Naval Base, a telephone operator overheard a conversation stating that a submarine was in serious trouble, eventually catching the Kursk's name. News from the small base soon reached the ears of family members, but they were assured by the deputy base commander that nothing out of the ordinary was occurring. On the same day that the Kursk had sunk, even before the Kremlin had been informed, the United States was already aware of the disaster and swiftly moved to inform its NATO allies. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, and Norway, many of which had vessels already near the accident site, all offered aid in rescuing possible survivors. But the Russian government refused, claiming that the rescue was well underway. The Russian Navy eventually held a press conference informing people of the disaster but claimed that rescue was imminent. It was not. A day after the sinking, one of the 2 rescue submersibles aboard the fleet's sole rescue vessel collided with the wreckage from the Kursk, slightly damaging the vehicle. The damaged rescue submersible was forced to rise, having confirmed the location of the Kursk propeller and stern stabilizer, but not the submarine itself. The second submersible was prepared for operations and launched 4 hours later, at 10:40 p.m., but was given a wrong heading by the Peter Velikia and forced to resurface at 1 a.m. on Monday morning without having found the Kursk. The salvage tug Nikolai Chikir managed to use deep water camera equipment to get images of the Kursk, showing severe damage to the bow and its sail. with the body of the submarine listing at 25 degrees. The bow had burrowed itself 22 meters into the seabed at a depth of 108 meters, well above the Kursk's crush depth. Its periscope was also discovered to still be raised, indicating that the accident had occurred while she was just 20 meters from the surface. The first rescue submersible was repaired and relaunched at 5 a.m. on Monday morning. Nearly 2 hours later, it located the Kursk and tried without success to attach to the aft escape trunk over the Kursk's 9th compartment. Since the sub was above crush depth and most of the damage was to the bow, there was good reason to hope that at least some of the crew has survived in the rearward watertight compartments. However, unable to create a vacuum seal with the escape trunk, the sub's batteries were quickly exhausted and it was forced to surface. With no spare batteries, the crew had to wait until the onboard batteries were recharged, but by that time, sea conditions had worsened and the Russians were unable to continue launching rescue operations. That morning, Monday, August 14th, the Russian Ministry of Defense made its first official announcement concerning the incident. It claimed that the submarine had, quote, descended to the ocean floor, which was technically true. According to the Russian MOD, the crew had been forced to ground the submarine due to a mechanical breakdown, but air and power were being pumped to the submarine from the surface. This was at least 50% true, though the crew had had exactly zero choice in the immediate grounding of the Kursk. The MOD also claimed that they were in radio contact with the crew. The weather worsened considerably over the next 2 days, during which the Russians attempted to connect a diving bell to the sub twice and attach an ROV to the rescue hatch with no success. One of the rescue submersibles was launched again late on Tuesday night, but it was damaged as it struck a boom while being lowered into the turbulent waters and had to be brought back on board for repairs. It was relaunched over an hour later, but again failed to make contact with the sunken Kursk. That same day, now 3 days after the sinking, a crane ship with more advanced rescue submersibles finally arrived, but was unable to launch due to bad weather. The Russians instead moved closer to the coast and launched a rescue submersible there, then simply towed it to deeper water over the Kursk. At 12:20 a.m. on Wednesday morning, a rescue submersible attempted to attach to the 9th compartment escape hatch but again failed to create a seal. When it surfaced and was being lifted back onto the deck of its mothership, its propulsion system was seriously damaged, forcing the crew to cannibalize it for parts to repair one of the other submersibles. The rescue submersible being towed from the coast arrived shortly after, but also failed to latch onto one of the Kursk's escape hatches, while a storm on the surface damaged one of the rescue capsules still topside. 5 days after the sinking, President Putin finally accepted British and Norwegian help. 6 teams of British and Norwegian divers arrived on Friday, August 18th. The next day, a full week after the Kursk had been lost, a Norwegian ship with a British rescue submarine arrived on site. Russian naval officials placed restrictions on what parts of the submarine the Norwegian divers could work on, which significantly impeded their rescue efforts. Upon locating the air control valve on the exterior of the submarine, Russian experts warned the divers that they must open it counterclockwise or they would break it. With the valve not budging, the divers went against the Russians' advice and turned it in the opposite direction, immediately opening the valve. On Monday, the 21st of August, the rescue trunk was discovered to be full of water, dashing hopes of rescuing any crew. Using a custom tool to open the internal hatch leading to the rescue trunk, the divers released a large volume of air from inside of the 9th compartment, discovering multiple bodies. The Russian government finally admitted that the submarine was completely flooded and all crew had died. Though again, they were conveniently only telling half-truths. The discovery of the airtight compartment 9 indicated that a number of the crew had survived the initial disaster and sat on the bottom of the sea awaiting rescue that came far too late. Norwegian divers used specialized tools to cut holes in the hull of the submarine, but only Russian divers were allowed to enter the wreck itself, removing secret documents and discovering badly burned bodies, indicating that there had been a significant explosion. 12 bodies were pulled from compartment 9, destroying the Russian government's official story that all aboard had died immediately upon the Kursk sinking. The official Russian story soon shifted to blaming a collision with a NATO submarine, or possibly a World War II naval mine, as the reason behind the Kursk disaster. Many Russian hardliners adopted the story of the collision with the NATO submarine sent to spy on the exercise, but there was never any evidence given. An investigation panel was set up, but most of the members on it had a special interest directly staked to the outcome of the investigation, with no independent investigators being allowed onto the special board. Thus, the ultimate report was seen as not very credible. The official report blamed an explosion from the practice torpedo caused by a leak of its high-test peroxide fuel. The initial explosion destroyed the torpedo room and killed everyone in the first compartment, with a blast wave entering as far back as the fourth compartment. Everyone in the command post in the second compartment was immediately incapacitated by the blast entering via an air conditioning vent. The explosion caused a fire which set off the warheads on 5 to 7 additional torpedoes, leading to the massive 4.2 Richter scale event detected around the world. However, the recovery of a partially burned set of safety instructions for the operation of the onboard torpedoes revealed that they were from a completely different type of torpedo altogether. The Russian Navy was discovered to have never inspected the Kursk crew's qualifications to handle and fire HTP torpedoes, and the crew, in fact, had no experience or training with this type of torpedo. Due to a lack of experience, bad or no training, and equally bad leadership, it's believed that the torpedo room crew themselves directly caused the initial explosion. More tragically, while most of the crew likely died, at least 24 had survived in the ninth compartment long after the submarine sunk. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov had written a note listing the name of the 23 other sailors alive in the compartment after the Kursk sank. These men, however, all died when someone mishandled a cartridge of potassium superoxide used to power a chemical oxygen generator. These cartridges absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen in emergencies, but are highly reactive. Upon coming in contact with seawater, the cartridge immediately caused a flash fire which consumed all remaining oxygen in the compartment. Investigation of the wreckage showed that some of the men avoided the initial fire by diving underwater, but were forced to surface into an environment with no remaining oxygen and asphyxiated. For 5 days after the disaster, Vladimir Putin, who was only 4 months into his presidency, continued to enjoy his holiday at the presidential resort in Sochi on the Black Sea. As a result, Putin's approval ratings, which had been extremely high during his election bid, plummeted drastically. But democracy is an illusion in Russia anyway, so that doesn't really matter. Now go check out 50 submarine facts that will shock you, or click this other video instead. The Emperor protects.